data.
I've got that lightning inside me, son of a god. I'm like a titan that's rising, oh, just you watch. I'm stepping in the fade. There is no time to waste. I've got that lightning inside me. This is how legends are made. This is how legends are made. This is how legends are made. I'm cranking up on the throttle, victory is mine. Show you the harder the battle, harder I fight. I've come too far to quit. Step back, I'm going in. I'm cranking up on the throttle. This is how legends are made. This is how legends are made. This is how legends are made.
Hello everyone. Welcome to the Armchair Admirals. We are live now. I'm sorry for the slight delay, but there were some technical issues we had to solve, and we solved thanks to the miracle workmanship of Mr. Conway, who introduced some new things. So obviously some things got broken, but we are live now, and we are live on the topic of Battle of Jutland. And because this is such a big topic, I'm not going to be able to talk through all of this alone from our team. So let me introduce Prince Blip.
Hello, everyone.
Introduce yourselves.
Hello, everyone. My name is Prince Blip. I am a World of Warships Legends community manager, which is the console version of the title for Xbox and PlayStation. A little bit about me: huge history buff, history major, and I've been long time interested in anything naval affairs, being that both of my grandparents are naval, and made sure that I was heavily ingrained into the history of the U.S. Navy. This isn't the U.S. Navy, but we'll get there someday.
Yes. And let's welcome our guests. So, in no particular order, it's not alphabetical, it's not fully random, but let's start with Mr. Drakenifel. Hello.
Hello. It's Drakenifel. I am the survivor so far, obviously of youtube.com/Drakenifel, as seen in the lovely little title thing that's going on beneath me. So yeah, I'm here. I do naval history on YouTube. I occasionally do naval history in other places as well, mostly YouTube. So hi everyone.
Now let's move on to the dreadnought dueling specialist, Dr. Alexander Clark. Hello.
Hello. I am Dr. Alex Clark. I am an early career researcher and academic. I have a Twitter, which is @AC_naval history, and a YouTube channel, which, as you've so kindly pointed out, and it has been causing a lot of fun recently. I've just been doing a series of dreadnoughts and development of dreadnoughts in 1905 to 1914, although I did the last video was on 1915 and then it was alive. And I introduced people to the concept, and a lot of my viewers have now enjoyed this. Now they've gone back that there was more than just a load of two-way naval races. That actually the whole dreadnought race was kind of global, and sometimes it's not Britain building against Germany. Sometimes it's Britain building numbers against Germany and going, but hang on, the Americans are building those very big, sexy guns, and so the Italians. Oh, we'd better go bigger. Because the Italians and the Americans did love their big, sexy guns.
Yes. So, if you didn't watch the Dreadnought series yet, go and watch it because it's fun. Also, go and watch the interesting VOD where Dr. Clark is talking about the Star Wars ship designs and how they make or mostly don't make sense.
This is the trouble of having patron suggestions.
Yes. And our last guest, our is our newest guest, first time appearance. It all started on Twitter when he felt that maybe this will be too one-sided against Admiral Beatty and he needs some defender. So, hello, and please introduce yourself and your channels.
Hello, my name is Wesley Livesey. I've done the History of the Great War podcast. I'm currently working on the History of the Second World War podcast. I like nice, small topics like that. As another American, I can confirm that we do like big, sexy guns. Maybe too much sometimes. Oh, and you can find my podcast at historyofthesecondworldwar.com, which I'm still amazed that URL was open a year ago, but it was.
Yeah, well... probably everyone thought, this has to be taken already, so let's not even try. In any case, let's now switch to all 5 of us. The format will be fairly standard for those of you who watched the video, but for those of you who watch for the first time, we will first make a short, concise overview of what happened, with which Mr. Drachenifel volunteered to give an overview, given his research. And then we will dig into your questions, and we will talk about the questions, talk about the answers, and obviously we will be taking questions from the chat. And just as a forewarning, we are keeping the big question, the who won, to the end. So don't expect us to pass judgment before we get there. Yeah, I mean, that's it. So let's head to what the hell happened.
Okay. Right, so how to explain the Battle of Jutland in hopefully under 10 minutes. It all starts with the High Seas Fleet's aim to try and win the naval war. They are not aiming to fight the entirety of the Royal Navy. They know that they cannot win this fight. The Royal Navy just has too many ships. So their strategy is to try and isolate a small portion of the Royal Navy and destroy that. And if they can repeat that once or twice, then hopefully they'll have whittled the Royal Navy down to something approximating the same size, and then they can get stuck into a fleet engagement because they're relatively confident, at least in their opinion, that they can win an engagement that's roughly 1v1. In aid of this, they've done a number of coastal raids against the North Sea coast of the UK, and to a certain extent, this has sort of succeeded in their aim of getting the British to detach part of their fleet, in this case the battle cruiser fleet, to base further south to try and respond to these engagements. Now, Jutland starts off initially as another one of these ideas. So you send first scouting group, the German battle cruisers, out. You have the High Seas Fleet following along behind. First scouting group attacks some targets, the British respond, first scouting group falls back, hopefully draws the British force onto the guns of the High Seas Fleet, you destroy it, happy days. Unfortunately for the Germans, the British have this wonderful thing called Room 40, which is intercepting all of their communications and decoding most of them. So the British know that the Germans are planning a major operation before most of the German sailors in the High Seas Fleet know that they're planning a major operation, which results in the slightly paradoxical situation of the Grand Fleet sailing for what will eventually become the Battle of Jutland before the German fleet, whose operation it actually is, sails for the Battle of Jutland. They all go wandering off into the North Sea, and again, in a sort of slightly absurd circumstance, it all starts off a little bit by chance. There happens to be a single, rather lonely and soon rather bemused steamer wandering along, and it stops for a minute to blow off some steam because it's got a little bit too much steam in its boilers. This, of course, sends out a big plume of steam, and coming south, you have light cruisers of the battle cruiser fleet, and they see this plume of steam on the horizon. They think, maybe I should go and investigate that. I wonder what that is. And almost, not quite, but almost 180 degrees opposite to them are scouting units of Hipper's first scouting group, and they also see the giant plume of steam and decide, I wonder what that is, maybe I should go and have a look at that. They both sort of see each other and immediately forget the steamer and start shooting at each other, and it kind of all degenerates from there. So the British forces attack the Germans fall back on some stronger forces of their own, so the British fall back on their own vessels, which are BT's battle cruisers. They then pursue the German forces, which fall back on Hipper's first scouting group battle cruisers, and so begins the run to the south. During all this, BT has been he's just started a program of cycling his battle squadrons up to Scapa Flow in order to engage in gunnery practice, because their current base in the Firth of Forth in Rosyth is not conducive to long-range gunnery practice. Scapa is. So 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadron, which is made up of the Invincible class, is actually with Jellicoe, and Jellicoe has detached 5th Battle Squadron, made up of what at the time are the 4 most powerful battleships in the world of the Queen Elizabeth class, to make up the numbers in the battle cruiser fleet. However, BT hasn't actually bothered to talk to Admiral Evan Thomas aboard 5th Battle Squadron, and so Admiral Evan Thomas has no idea what BT actually wants him to do, or how BT commands his fleet. The battle
You're
cruisers...
not expecting BT to talk to people, are you, again?
Well, maybe, but
Yeah.
But anyway, BT heads off south, charging after the German battle cruisers. Admiral Evan Thomas is kind of sitting there going, "Where'd everybody go?" And eventually decides, well, maybe I should follow him, even though I haven't actually seen any orders saying that I should. This means that when BT's battle cruisers actually run into Hipper's battle cruisers, instead of having an almost 2-to-1 advantage, the British only actually have 1 additional vessel. They start off having a gunfight, which isn't helped by the fact that the British outrange the German battle cruisers, but BT lets the German battle cruisers close to within the Germans' gun range anyway, because there's mistakes made in the range finding. So you get this cannonade going back and forth. Unfortunately for the British, there are a couple of issues on their side. One of which is that there are some questionable ammunition handling procedures going on aboard the battlecruiser fleet, in part because they've been trying to up their rate of fire as a way of making up for the fact that most of the fleet of the battlecruisers don't seem to be able to shoot for toffee. The idea being to just smother the area with enough shells, and theoretically that'll end up with a lot of hits. And also, to be perfectly honest, you have HMS Indefatigable, which is one of the Indefatigable class, who really has no business being in a battle line with any kind of heavy firepower. Shortly thereafter, this is demonstrated by Indefatigable exploding rather violently. This is something of a downer, but hey, it's now 1v1 for the British, so okay, let's keep going. Then Queen Mary explodes, equally violently. Now the British are at a numbers disadvantage. This is not going well. Princess Royal gets smothered by near misses, and BT thinks that she's blown up as well, which prompts the famous comment, "I think there's something wrong with our bloody ships today." And just when it looks like everything's going horribly, horribly wrong, or even more horribly wrong for battle cruiser fleet, because Lion has been hit repeatedly, Princess Royal's been hit. Pretty much the only one who's coming out of this with flying colours at the moment is New Zealand, mostly because it has divine protection, courtesy of a Maori war skirt and jade pendant.
That comes in handy.
Then 5th Battle Squadron arrives, and suddenly the tables are turned, because now the numbers advantage is back, and 5th Battle Squadron is, of course, full-on battleships armed with lots of 15-inch guns. And despite the fact that British armour-piercing fuses aren't working as well as they could be, they do start laying the hurt on the Germans quite badly. So
Let's be honest, one of the things that's often forgotten with that thing is that if you're being hit with a 15-inch shell, that's still a lot of kinetic energy and mass hitting you. That's
yes,
going to hurt.
at one point, Seydlitz is hit so hard by a 15-inch shell that a survivor of the ship on the main deck watches the entire stern wiggle back and forth. And bearing in mind this is a 20,000-plus ton battle cruiser, it takes a lot of energy to make the stern of your ship whip back and forth so hard that the radio aerials on your mast snap. Then the tables are turned once again, because Hipper, who has been running south, drawing them into the High Seas Fleet, has now drawn them onto the High Seas Fleet. BT takes one look at the High Seas Fleet, and for the first time that day makes a sensible decision to run away. He fails to tell Admiral... Sorry?
There's just a comment from Dan Friedman on Twitch that the Battle of Jutland was BT's third attempt to rid the Royal Navy of the battlecruisers.
Yes. Yeah. So he now tries to run away. 5th Battle Squadron again, is not actually told that this is what he's doing. So Admiral Evan Thomas's first inclination that something has changed is when Lion comes steaming past the other way. And Evan Thomas sitting going, well, where do you think you're going and why? And oh, it's the German fleet. Oh dear, right. So after a while, he decides to do a 180 as well, resulting in 5th Battle Squadron getting rather heavily hit by the High Seas Fleet. And really, it's the fact only that they are so powerful and so heavily built that lets them survive. Warspite takes a particular beating, which will come back to haunt her a little bit later on. So off they go back north. The 1st Scouting Group and the High Seas Fleet are now in pursuit in a slightly elongated line because they've picked up a few pre-dreadnoughts as well as the Nassau's and Helgolands, which aren't the fastest, so they're kind of lagging a bit. So they're chasing the British now, thinking, right, our plan has worked, fantastic, we've got an isolated portion of the British fleet, we can destroy them. Beatty, of course, has not actually been telling Jellicoe, coming south of the Grand Fleet, any of this. Fortunately for Jellicoe, 2nd Light Cruiser Squadron has a signals officer and an admiral with a functioning brainstem and has sent some information to Jellicoe. Jellicoe uses a combination of gut feeling and tactical genius to deploy his fleet in a portside turning maneuver to open them up into a battle line, which turns out to be near enough a perfect choice, as just as he has that fleet in deployment, the High Seas Fleet show up. 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadron, the ones who've been training with the Grand Fleet, show up. They have a quick firefight with Lutzow and Der Flinger. Invincible manages to inflict mortal wounds on Lutzow, but Lutzow manages to completely annihilate Invincible in another spectacular explosion, which paradoxically one of the men who's actually in the turret that blows up survives. But the rest of the High Seas Fleet now gets incredibly badly battered by the Grand Fleet. They've had their T crossed.
Yeah. I'll just quickly switch the map to the
map. Yeah.
To illustrate
there we go.
What happened to the High Sea Fleet.
So Shear, bearing in mind at this point, has no idea the Grand Fleet is there, and we have really bad visibility. There's fog, murk, gun smoke, ship smoke, etc. Literally, in his own account, the first thing he realizes that the Grand Fleet is around is when, as he describes it, the entire northern horizon catches fire, which is the Grand Fleet opening fire. He takes one look at the shells pummeling his vanguard and realizes this is a bad situation to be in. He has his entire fleet do a simultaneous 180-degree turn, which is quite the feat of seamanship, and vanishes off into the murk. Everyone thinks, oh, well, that was a bit anticlimactic, but let's chase on regardless. Jellicoe's fleet, as we can see on the right-hand side of that diagram, sails south, and Hipper and Shear decide that, well, they know that they are heading kind of south by southwest. They think, well, maybe the British are following us, which of course they are, and so they think, well, maybe if we turn east, we can break contact completely. Unfortunately, as it turns out, Jellicoe is kind of to their northeast and gradually overhauling them, so when they turn east, they end up running into Jellicoe's fleet a second time. And once again, the vanguard of the High Seas Fleet gets pummeled by the British guns. This time, the trap is actually much deadlier than the first time, and Shear realizes that there's a very good chance that if he doesn't distract the British with something, the leading elements of his fleet, which are the most modern ships in his fleet, the Kaisers and Koenigs, might well actually be sunk. So he throws the now very battered 1st Scouting Group at the British, along with a mass torpedo boat attack, and the rest of the fleet does another 180 and disappears off into the darkness. The distraction kind of works, although the German battlecruisers aren't particularly appreciative of the pummeling they get. They actually kind of come through in part because there are just so many British ships shooting at them, no one can quite figure out whose shell splashes belong to which ship, and so more shells actually missed than there otherwise should be. Then they break off. Lutzow, as the night goes on, Lutzow eventually founders. Everyone's proceeding south. Jellicoe thinks he knows where the High Seas Fleet is going. As it turns out, he's wrong. Shear decides that he's going to actually go for a different entrance into the German minefields to get home, and once again cuts back east. Although, once again, because the Grand Fleet is slightly faster than the German fleet, now the Grand Fleet is actually head. BT's battle cruisers are off forward and starboard of the Grand Fleet, which means that paradoxically, for a good portion of the night, the British battle cruisers are leading the German fleet. Although nobody knows this. The High Seas Fleet then turns to port, heads east, and it ends up crossing through the rear of the British line where all the destroyer flotillas are. For some reason completely unknown to God nor men, nobody in the multiple destroyer squadrons that the German fleet is gradually chewing through bothers to actually tell Jellicoe that, the German fleet is coming through our lines, maybe we should do something about this. And there's a series of confused night actions which result in a couple of British cruisers and quite a few destroyers being sunk. The Germans lose a couple of ships as well, including SMS Permern, which takes a torpedo hit amidship and just detonates in a spectacular ball of fire, which is now not a particularly uncommon occurrence at this battle. And then the German fleet slips on through into the night. Jellicoe technically is actually told where they're going, but the selective and contradictory information the Admiralty has been sending him means he doesn't actually believe them until it's too late, which means that come dawn, the Grand Fleet is left sitting almost at the edge of the German minefields and no High Seas Fleet in sight. The High Seas Fleet has gone via their alternate route and they're mostly safe. And the battle just kind of runs out. And everyone then goes back home trying to collect survivors and counting up losses and obviously trying to work out who exactly has won, thus starting a controversy that has never technically finished. And with I think that's pretty much Jutland in as compact a form as I can make it.
And I would like to add on to that it basically epitomizes the whole thing that BT is the World War I version of Rommel. For Rommel, logistics is something which happens to other people. For BT, communications is something that happens to other people.
Other people communicate with him, not the other way. Anyway, just to illustrate the point of the confused night action that was described, this is, I believe, HMS Spitfire
Yes.
in a status which is a result of a collision with the Nassau, with the dreadnought battleship.
Yes,
she
ends up in the night action in a close range firefight with Nassau such a close range firefight that Nassau's guns physically cannot de-elevate lower enough to actually shoot her. Hence why there's not much of the superstructure left and the funnels look like an angry giant has stepped on them, because that's what happens when you fire 11-inch guns right over the top of a World War I destroyer. The crumpled in bow is because she actually sideswipes Nassau and miraculously comes out of it without sinking, but does wander off with a 20-foot chunk of Nassau's armor plate left on her bow.
It's a souvenir.
Yeah.
You got to keep in mind these are World War I destroyers. They're not the large 1,500, 2,000 ton destroyers you see in World War II. These are sometimes not even reaching 1,000.
Yeah, basically, if you check in a game all the tier 2, 3 destroyers, this is what this is. The tiny, basically torpedo boats. The World War I vintage. That's
yes.
It's also is a British destroyer, so expecting to come home from what is sort of a port visit without some contraband is completely illogical. It's going to happen.
You have to bear in mind, as Prince Split was just saying, that the Germans at this stage, although they have their light craft, are near enough in most cases about equivalent displacement to the British destroyers. The dividing line is so thin, the Germans are actually still calling them all torpedo boats.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, with Germany, it kind of persisted until the World War II, when basically the Kriegsmarine had two lines of destroyers. They had the small destroyers, the Torpedo, and the large fleet destroyers, the Z boats. So that's they kind of like that concept, I guess. So yeah, thank you for the quick introduction. And any other comments from anyone before we launch into the questions?
Yeah, so I'd just like to throw out, and Drakvenil mentioned it a few times, but one of the interesting themes that you see about this battle, especially if you read the accounts of people like Sheer and Jellicoe, is that for most of the battle, they had no idea what was happening. And they were very much in the dark based on not getting information from the front and where their ships fell in the formations that they sort of ended up in with all their twisting and turning. So the complete lack of information is such a critical part of this action.
Yep. And especially with the British fleet, they had a aversion to using radio, generally, in general, for all their operations. And so, unless you can see where a ship is, you don't necessarily know where it is. So,
the British don't have an aversion to using radio. The British tend to like to use radio on minimum power because they know from their own people how good they are at detecting it. It's sort of the British idea about radio comes from the fact that they spend the whole time tracking the Germans by radio, who basically never transmit on anything less than full power. So that it's not so a case of they don't want to use it. They try and use it on minimal power, and they try various things because they know how much of a giveaway it can be. And if they're going to ambush a German ambush, they really don't want them to know they're there.
Yep.
This is kind of, indicative that basically every army, every navy is primarily basically trying to learn how to fight against themselves because they know what they can do, so they presume that the enemy can do the same. It was the same in early World War II in Pacific, when many older school American admirals were averse to using radar because they were afraid that the Japanese would be able to detect them earlier. And that resulted in quite few messes. Anyway, we have a quick comment quick question from the Twitch, from Crazy Locha. From YouTube, which is for the beginning of the battle. The question is, was the steamer related to the Kamchatka?
I don't think so, mainly on the grounds that it in and of itself was not responsible for shooting at or sinking anyone, although it did start off a rather cascade process of everybody else trying to sink everybody else. But it wasn't Russian flag. I think it was Danish, actually. Of all things. And
the second follow-up question is, did the steamer survive?
Yes. They kind of, because the battle started with this run to the south, and then generally, despite the subsequent chase to the north, everything gradually does move south. The steamer was basically left to witness most of the ships present, bar the High Seas Fleet, just all merrily sailing past it, just going, well, I guess we probably should go somewhere else.
Yeah, you don't want to be there.
Yes, and let's launch into the pre-recorded question. I think we have a very good introduction question here from That Boy, which was picked by Wesley as a question to start answering with. That basically, why did Germany build such a huge navy before World War I?
So that's a very long story. You could spend a lot of time, a lot of YouTube videos, I'm sure Dr. Clark could talk about, discussing this topic. And the sort of the basis of it comes about 16 years before Jutland, at around, very, very late years of the 1800s, early years of the 1900s. And you have would become Admiral Tirpitz, is kind of a leader of this German naval movement. He convinces people like the Kaiser and others that Germany should have a navy. And it's the same reason that a lot of other nations build a navy at this point. Germany has colonies. Germany wants more colonies. Germany wants to theoretically defend those colonies. And also the navy is seen as a way to sort of join this great power club of the world, to sort of assert Germany's place within that group. And they do a really good job. They do a great job of publicity, of convincing everybody in Germany that, hey, we should build a lot of ships. And so they start building. And this grows over time. At the beginning, there's a lot of concern that the British might launch some sort of preemptive strike on the Germans. They use this as kind of a way to pump up paranoia so they can build more ships. And over time, they become a real threat to the British, even though the British, are they a real threat? Well, the British certainly claim that they're a real threat so that they can justify building more ships as well. And then Germany has a navy. In my opinion, Germany is never actually a real threat to the Royal Navy's sort of power, especially at this period in history. Maybe if the Germans would have built more ships, but in the case, the Royal Navy probably just would have built even more, because that's kind of the time period we're in for British history.
Yeah.
It's the geography of it. It's the position of where they are in terms of their placement, and there's the threat to Britain, because Britain is the heart of the empire, and that's a very strong navy close to it. But also, you have to remember the British basically factor in, okay, whatever navy they have, we have to maintain a 50% greater force here in home fleet to protect against them, whilst also still having ships to go and cover the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, the Pacific, all the British Empire around the world. So it's kind of a case of, yes, they're never really a threat in terms of numbers when you're considering the aggregate, but that doesn't really help the British, because what they have to think about is we might not be fighting them, we might be fighting someone else, and then they decide to take advantage of it. So we still have to have those ships there. The trouble is with Turpit's whole idea, it's based around the risk fleet strategy, and the strategy is you can deter Britain by being powerful enough. The trouble is Britain can't afford for someone to be powerful enough they can deter them at sea, because that would undermine the entire British Empire, which is based on maritime and naval dominance. So the whole idea is a false logic, because Britain will never allow you to build enough ships that you can reach that point. So they'll always build more, so you always need to build more, so you're just setting yourself up for a building race, and a very expensive one. So
And I think
yeah, Karen.
And the building race is really exemplified by, and I forget which year it is, which I know is horrible, but at some point, like, the Germans build 3 or 4 dreadnoughts in a year, and the British are like, how about 6? Bring it.
Yeah. And to be honest, this is one of the other thing that's somewhat forgotten by the is that by the time you're just getting into the First World War, say 1913, 1914, the Germans have actually given up on the idea of a building race with the British. It just so happens that that is completely overshadowed by the outbreak of the First World War. But as Wesley said, the British have this surge of building, and then they keep building 4 ships, and the occasional battle cruiser. And then you get to 1912, 1913, 1914, and somewhere in the depths of the British Admiralty, they've just gone, you know what, stuff it. 5 Queen Elizabeths, and then the next year it's 8 Revenges, and the Germans basically look at it and just go, blow this for a laugh, we've got better things to spend our marks on.
Yeah, and obviously, while this naval race goes on, everyone else who wants to be something on the sea also keeps piling on. I mean, you had Russia building dreadnoughts, France, Italy, USA, and given the way the Europe worked back then, for example, nobody knew which side will Italy end up on, in the eventuality of the
Italy
war.
produced the most beautiful ships. They produced some lovely designs. You know, their equivalent of the Queen Elizabeth class would have been beautiful. They were lovely looking ships.
And you've got some very sorry.
Well, you also have Spain. You can't ever forget the España class. They're cute. They're these little baby dreadnoughts. They're baby dreadnoughts. They're lovely little things. They're the only dreadnoughts where you can actually excuse them having their guns so they'll fire past the superstructure, because their barrels are long enough. They might be next to the superstructure, but they'll actually be firing from past the superstructure, so it won't actually damage the superstructure. It's the only time I support wing turrets. They're lovely. They're cute.
Yeah, you've got all sorts of. Go on.
Yeah, that brings in the question that was highlighted because wing turrets. So why did the German Navy continue with wing turrets on dreadnought battleships and on battle cruisers longer than basically most other navies?
Who chose that question?
I kind of wrote down some notes in there. Largely, it's one big thing with the German Navy at this time is that they have made somewhat major budget limitations per ship. They're limited to, I believe it's roughly 45 million Reichsmarks per ship, and that continues throughout their entire dreadnought building period. So they have to make sure that their designs are becoming more efficient as they go, but not necessarily are they able to increase their power very much. which is why you see ships quite similar to each other with like the Koenigs and the Kaisers. Plus, in the Nassaus and the Helgolands, you have triple expansion engines, which tend to be very tall, which is why you end up with wing turrets on those, because you don't necessarily have room in the center of the ship to put a turret there. And then also, generally, there's a lack of faith of super firing turrets, which eventually went away when America started doing it and a few of the other nations started getting successful with it. And then, of course, when it comes to you having one wing turret on each side rather than a hexagonal shape, that's a weight savings. In theory, you get the same broadside weight, but you have to have two less turrets. You get to have two less turrets. So you save money and you save weight. And but in practice, it doesn't really work. So grand
It's
idea.
also to do with depth of hull in terms of draft you're planning on take and the Kiel Canal to an extent. And all these things do have a factor into the German designs. There's also, and I will point this out with the German, with the 45 million, that does come up a lot. And it is a legitimate thing, which is part of it. But there's also, you have to remember, the German Navy is also quite good at manipulating where the funds go. They're not quite in the same class as the Royal Navy, which will order a ship called HMS Unicorn prior to World War II and claim the whole way through it's not an aircraft carrier. It's a forward aviation support ship. The fact it looks like an aircraft carrier is just because you don't understand ships. It's not an aircraft carrier. But the German Navy is fairly decent at going, yes, well, yes, we already know. But all those guns, those guns, well, they were bought for destroyers, we know, but the destroyers aren't available, so we're going to use them as the secondary armament or extra guns on our battleships and all this sort of thing. So the actual figures with all battleships, and I say this about all navies, honestly, when you're going through them, is there lies. There are lies, damn lies, statistics, and military accountancies.
Yeah, and the other thing you've got to remember with this is you have the very first ship, Dreadnought, starts out the Dreadnought race with an 8-gun broadside. Therefore, everybody has to either have more guns or bigger guns or both for their broadsides for subsequent ships. Almost everyone at this point is limited to twin turrets. Triple turrets are actually quite difficult to crack at this period. Oddly enough, the Austro-Hungarians and the Russians are the ones who make the breakthroughs in World War One. The French kind of just go, stuff it, we're skipping from twins straight to quads because we're French, but that's somewhat later on in the game. But everyone else is limited to twins, partly through a little bit of conservatism, partly because they can't get the blasted things to work properly. And so that means if you want a lot of guns, you either have to do what the Americans do with the Wyomings and the Delawares and just make an extremely long ship covered in twin turrets, or you end up having to try and find some way of not having a massively long vessel, and that usually means the wing turrets, because if you sit them in echelon, you don't need quite the same hull length. And then, of course, you have the Brazilians who, as has been put up here, they just went with HMS Agincourt and just like, well, there's turrets and there's turrets and then there's more turrets, and occasionally I think we'll add another turret.
Hey, turrets are good. We need more turrets.
Yes. With Agincourt's case, they originally the Brazilians were considering 14-inch six turrets with 14-inch guns. Then they saved money on logistically because they already had 12-inch gun ships. They decided to go 12-inch guns. But they needed her to have more guns than the previous battleships they already had in service, so that she'd be more powerful. She'd be a increased status. So they added on an extra turret.
Yeah,
literally the turrets were the status.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we have another question here. Sorry. Given the longer history of the Royal Navy compared to the newer high seas fleet, how much of an institutional knowledge or moral difference was there between the two sides, crews and commanders, from random profile? And I believe Dr. Clark picked this question.
Yes, I did. And it's one of those interesting things because of the longer service of the Royal Navy. its institutional memory is something which it does have to draw from. If you look at the Battle of Cornell, if you look at other battles go through, the Royal Navy does have a sort of pressure, a codicil on what it's supposed to act like. But you also have to remember that by this point, the Royal Navy has been being held up as the Navy to emulate, or at least to try and copy for quite a long time. And Prussia, Germany, was for a long time allies of the Royal Navy, like the Japanese were, and various others. So they've actually copied a lot of their culture across into their own navies. Now, they've adapted in their own ways. You've got the Germans have gone with the very much European command structure in terms of its naming and its phraseology, which is always an interesting one, but that actually also does make sense, because in the Royal Navy, a lieutenant commander is a lieutenant commander, but they can also be captains of things. They can be captains of small ships. In the German Navy, they had Corvetti Kapitan, Frigetti Kapitan, and Kapitan. So they, you had this sort of, it makes sense in a way that's part of their rank, and that's also what they are. They're a captain. But the Royal Navy, it could be a lieutenant commander as a captain, including some ships where had a lieutenant as a captain. So you have two different sets of very much emotional in terms of their memory and their institutional thinking and their institutional beliefs, emotional debts. But you also in the Royal Navy have certain things in there, which is that a Royal Navy Admiral does know the history of the fact that other Royal Navy Admirals have, maybe a long time before this, but have been executed on their own quarterdeck for failing to engage the enemy. And whilst
Come on, it happened
they
only
know
once. 3 times? Oh, didn't know that.
there was the latest one is the one we know about with Bing. We often discuss that one, but other ones have happened before that in the past where they've had. Let's put it this way: they haven't been done on their own quarterdeck, but they still haven't had a good time after it didn't engage a battle.
Yep.
What they do know, and BT and Jellicoe know this, is if they don't engage the Germans, if they don't engage the High Seas Fleet, they will be vilified and crucified by the press. And let's be honest, that can be worse than just being shot, because at least being shot, it only happens once and it's over. Whereas if you're vilified by the press, that can last for 20, 30 years if you live.
As it turns out, they did engage and were still vilified by the press. So not much
but
they could have a defense.
Yes, but at least their defense was they could say they did something, and Jellicoe could say, well, the Germans went back in, so, well, that gets on to who won the battle and that stuff, but basically, not engaging would have been even worse. So actually, all thanks to the Danish steamer, which decided to let off steam, and managed to start off the battle, although it does sound like a Benny Hill episode every time you put that in there.
The only thing I'd add to that is that there is one thing I would point out, which is that you've got institutional knowledge in terms of tactics, traditions, that kind of thing. This the Royal Navy has in spades. In terms of technical knowledge, the Germans can quite easily make a claim to have as much or more information as the Royal Navy because of the speed of technological advancement. And to give you some idea of that, if we take the Battle of Trafalgar, which ultimately is what everyone thinks Jutland is going to be the second one of, at the Battle of Trafalgar, HMS Victory, Nelson's flagship, is one of the most powerful ships there. It's 40 years old, and its form and its method of fighting would have been familiar to people 40 years before it was launched, and would be familiar to people 40 years after the Battle of Trafalgar, just when steam battleships start to come in. So there's a 120-year period in which if you just put HMS Victory into a painting of any battle during that period, no one's going to bat an eyelid. In 40 years back from 1914, we're only just getting to the period where some warships are beginning to think maybe we don't need sails. 80 years back, we're actually in the middle of the period where steam engines are a twinkle in someone's eye. Maybe there's a few experimental corvettes and that's it. 120 years back, we've actually gone back before the period of the Battle of Trafalgar, and we're back into the 18th century. So the amount of change that has happened in warship technology, and to a certain extent how you use those warships as a result, in even the past 20 years before 1914, is so massive that you might have known absolutely everything there was to know about battleship warship technology in 1894. Most of that doesn't make the slightest bit of difference to how you fight a war in 1914. And as a result, the German Navy, which in 1894 was pretty titchy, by 1914 can quite easily say, yeah, we know just as much about the big guns and the engines and the rangefinders and the fire control systems as practically anybody else.
Yeah, that's what I was
say
going to
the
bring up
British-
as well. Is that the rate of technological change before 1916 sets up a situation where the long history of the Royal Navy is only of marginal value at Jutland, but that long history, as Dr. Clark said, greatly elevated the expectations placed upon the Royal Navy in what it should do and how it should perform. I'll save the back half of that comment until we talk about who won.
Yes.
And
Okay.
I would add in that you have to remember the Royal Navy has managed to do actually something kind of interesting in the dreadnought program, in the construction of dreadnoughts, which the Germans weren't able to do, which is the British were able to build dreadnought, take a gap evaluator, and then build their next build the Bellerophons, and then build on that. And they kept taking gaps and building and the gaps and building because they could build more at a time. The Germans, once they start building dreadnoughts, just have to chuck in and go, build dreadnoughts. And they actually have got about 3 sets of dreadnoughts under construction at the same time, and none of them have only one of the first ones has just sort of entered the water and is just about to commission, and the other two are in 2 generations are in construction. So for the Germans, in many respects, their first generation of battleships, their first generation of dreadnoughts, lasts a lot longer than the British does, and they don't have as many experienced officers. That's the other advantage the Royal Navy has. Royal Navy has a larger pool of experienced officers to draw from. And
Just a pity they didn't draw on it for the battlecruiser fleet.
Well, I would. I was asked an interesting question the other day in a live, which is, would Craddock have done a better job in charge of the battlecruiser force than Beatty? And I think he probably would have. But the trouble is, he was lost at Cornell. And this is the other thing: the Royal Navy does have, it does try and have good admirals, but the trouble is, it does lose some of them. Another one, a good one they lose on that day is they lose Hood. They lose Hood at Jutland, and Hood is a really, really good officer. A really, really good officer. He's been commanding the forces of the coast of Belgium. He's been doing a spectacular job elsewhere in the war. And he's basically been unofficially brought into the battlecruiser force to try and fix it, because it's been considered after Dogger Bank especially that there are problems that Beatty has inoculated. The trouble is Beatty's very much a good press animal and very good at the publicity side, and is public. So they're trying to fix it from inside without causing trouble for the war effort. At one point, they did consider sending Beatty off to Gallipoli, but they thought that actually might cause more trouble out there than help, because they thought even he might make that worse.
For a second there, when you started with the Chi, I thought that it would end up with the guillotine and not Gallipoli. But
I guess to tie in there a little bit.
It wasn't quite that bad.
But we have a follow-up question here, actually, from the chat, from the Day Glenn. What role did naval tradition play in Jutland, i.e. not doing anything unless explicitly ordered?
It's a bit all over the place, really, because you do get some officers who are very, I have not been ordered to do this, therefore I will not do this. Evan Thomas is kind of straddles that line. He is actually a superb signals officer. I mean, he's an admiral at this point, but he knows his signals. He has a good flag officer to do signals for him. Unfortunately, he takes the kind of belief that, well, anyone of my rank or superior must have my skills or better. And so when Beatty fails to communicate with him, he kind of goes, well, obviously that was intentional. I'm not supposed to do anything. There is, to a certain degree, this problem in the Royal Navy of they're wedded a bit too much to letter of the law. Various admirals through time in the late 19th and early 20th century have recognized this. and they've tried to break the Royal Navy out of it. Admiral Tryon very famously tried and ended up getting rammed for his troubles.
Yes.
Jellicoe almost went down with Victoria, incidentally enough. But Jellicoe's been trying to encourage this a bit more as well, but it is something that's accreted over about a century where no one actually wants to fight the Royal Navy. And so there is still a lot of it present. There's a little bit more free thinking present amongst the destroyer captains, the light cruiser captains, which is mainly why they're there in the first place in those ships. But it does hamper the effectiveness of the Royal Navy to a certain degree. The flip side to that is that some of the other naval traditions that the Royal Navy has do actually stand them in very good stead. For example, a small one is Marlborough. When Marlborough is torpedoed, someone who's thinking purely on a technical level go, right, you're torpedoed, go home. We've still got enough numbers, we don't need you. Marlborough gamely sails on whilst water continues to pour into the torpedo hole in her side, and literally will keep sailing with the fleet until somebody notices her list is now so much that her guns can't elevate enough to make up for the list, and she can't actually shoot out to decent firing range, at which point she has to be told to go home. And you see this quite often as well. I mean, Warspite takes some convincing, even though it's half on fire and resembling a Swiss cheese with its rudder broken, to go home. So there are cases where ships will stay and hang in the fight and keep going when most sane people would have long ago run for the hills, which does stand them in good stead in certain engagements.
I think what you mentioned there's this clash of styles, which almost puts them in the worst possible situation, which you see throughout the battle, especially between Beatty and Evan Thomas, where there's two schools of thought interacting at the same time. One that's like, hey, use your best judgment. I'm going to tell you kind of what we're doing. Use your best judgment. And the other is like, if I tell you to turn left, you turn left. Full stop. So
yeah, but the trouble is that's not really what Beatty was doing. Beatty was not sending out any signals and hadn't had it. And you can do the whole band of brothers thing, to use your best judgment, if you've actually had a conversation and you know each other. You can't do it with someone who you haven't even met and talked with. That's not that.
I'm not
laziness.
To be clear, that's a mistake from Beatty.
Yes, but the thing is with Evan Thomas is that at a certain point he does realise, hang on, Beatty is an idiot and is not talking to me, and then starts making his own decisions quite happily. He does get disabused of the notion that his senior officer must be half as good at signals at least, or at least know how to make competent signals quite quickly at a certain point. I'm not sure how quickly. The accounts differ, and accounts of what Thomas was actually saying about BT halfway through the battle differ, from very respectful accounts to ones which suggest that he would have been running BT up his lanyards. But leaving that to one side, and he was quite a tall gentleman, as I understand it, Evan Thomas, so probably could have done it barehanded.
There was a comment in the chat that, like, the author of the comment wouldn't be surprised if even Thomas did deck BT after the battle. But I believe even
they were kept a respectful distance apart.
I believe even in the case of the fast battleships, the even Thomas's force, for example, the Malaya did actually act, let's say, against the letter of orders when basically the squadron was ordered to make a sequential turn, which would bring every ship basically in the predictable spot for the German ships to shoot at. So the Malaya just turned independently, and I believe her captain got into trouble, right? So
no, you basically see this. You basically see this happening repeatedly through the battle. Of a lot of officers, because they've had this drummed into them of you must follow orders to the letter. They will keep doing that until something goes so catastrophically wrong, it becomes obvious that if I keep following these orders, I'm going to die and everyone on my ship is going to die. And then they show that actually, yes, they can act independently and often do make quite interesting and decisive calls. It's just a shame that it usually takes this, either I do something or I explode, to get them to make those decisions. A few officers who are a little bit slow on that draw end up with the or I explode part of things.
And quite
Like
a few of
Admiral
those.
Arthur.
And quite a few officers of that as a school end up being the ones who get mysteriously found other assignments after the battle.
Hmm.
The ones who do exercise independent thinking get promoted, or at least they stay in their commands. The ones who have trouble find themselves given lovely appointments, beautiful ones, with nice, safe desks that don't float.
Yeah, I mean, I just recently saw on Twitter also posts of a similar example from actually post-war from the U.S. Navy, the famous Honda Point disaster that basically
Yeah.
was a commander of a destroyer squadron successfully running most of his squadron on most of his flotilla on the beach because he made a questionable order. But in any case, we have another question here, which should be fun for all involved. From Kuraken-sama, what should have PT do to A, not explode his bloody battlecruisers today, to use in any way the 5th Squadron power, and 3, actually win the battle, besides shooting it? Samer, I mean.
So who chose that as a response?
It was Dr. Clark.
Dr.
again.
Clark, yes.
Yes, I thought it was me. So, first off, to use 25th 5th Battle Squadron properly, he could have dropped a knot of speed, or possibly 2, to keep his force together, and actually communicated. I think if he'd had dinner with Thomas, Thomas would probably have, after a few minutes conversation with him and Seymour, as a good communications officer, would have realized that, frankly, I'm dealing with 2 people who might have good brains but cannot communicate to save their lives, so therefore I will remember this when I am carrying out orders. That would have been useful. Dinner with admirals, good idea. Next thing, and I'm going through this from memory of the question, so actually I've got it in front of me, I'll get it up in front of me.
Number 2
Yeah.
was... I have it here. Well, using anyway the 5th Squadron power. Well, I guess you addressed that
Not
as well.
explode his bloody battle cruisers. If he'd used 5th Squadron butter, he probably would have had that, because he could have, at the points at which they were being engaged, have played around with the squadrons and used 5th to basically to bear the brunt of the fighting, which they would have quite happily done. And honestly, if the German battle cruisers had been caught by 5th Battle Squadron for any length of time at the engagement speeds they could be chugging along at that point before they got support, they could well have been taken out. Because you have to remember, the German battle cruisers have a theoretical top speed, which they mostly achieve on testing with the help of Welsh coal, and then they have the speed they can achieve with German coal, which, depending on the accounts you believe, makes them either 1 to 2 knots slower. So, these things happen.
Yeah.
And if he'd had that, that would have been helpful. And actually winning the battle, all he needed to do to win the battle, even if he'd done everything else as he had done, if he told Jellicoe what was going on, and just made sure someone was telling Jellicoe, giving him regular updates, he could have masked it by claiming he was transmitting to London. He could have done a sort of a two Admiralty on full power. And then Jellicoe would have still heard it, wouldn't have asked for questions, would have just had the information reports coming in, and the Germans would never have realised the Grand Fleet was there. And that could have brought on the engagement, the actual engagement, 2, possibly 3 hours earlier. And then you have a big problem for the Germans, because if you have night taking place 2 to 3 hours later, considering the superior speed the British were able to achieve, and what Jellicoe managed to achieve with 2 engagements, if he'd managed to pull off a 3rd, which in that timeline he probably could have done, that could have been really, really nasty for the Germans, because you don't see, and not much of them survives that. They lose a lot of their new ships at the very least.
There was also a question that actually I just recalled from the chat, so before I forget it again, whether there were any repercussions or impact on Denmark from the battle, because it was I mean, it was happening fairly close to the Danish waters, even though I don't believe anyone strayed in the Danish territorial waters, right?
No, the Danish were rather sensibly going. The two largest fleets on the planet are knocking 6 bells out of each other just off of our coastline. We're going to do our level best to pretend nothing is happening whatsoever, because it's not in the Denmark's interest to antagonize either of those nations. Apart from occasionally sort of finding bits of debris and such like washing up on their shores.
I
So
think
yeah.
I think they sent out some of their Coast Guard ships for hospital duties to sort of recover people who might be in the water, but that sort of thing. That's all I did.
There was a comment actually returning a bit back to the battlecruiser speed and similar from Jaifov on Twitch chat. That we shouldn't forget the human factor, because coal means that the stokers are exhausted after shoveling for hours at a time. I mean, that's probably also taking a huge toll during the battle on both sides' coal-fired ship, right? Because
Yes, yeah. Both sides, the battle cruisers, the Queen Elizabeth are the only ships present that are fully oil powered, which is another thing that helps them maintain their speed. But everyone else is coal powered, and quite a few ships have oil spraying, which is they spray oil over the coal fires to help boost the power output. So it's not quite as taxing on the stokers as it might otherwise be. But it is still very, very difficult. And this is where it comes back round to what Dr. Clark was saying about differences in coal. If you've got really high quality anthracite coal, A, it burns with a higher energy output, so you need to shovel less. And B, it generates far less ash and clinker, so you don't need to clear the grates and everything as often. And so you can maintain your speed for longer. Whereas if you're shoveling bituminous coal, which is most of what you can find in Germany, certainly in any bulk, which is what ships need, it burns with a lower energy output, so you end up having to shovel a lot more on, and because it generates a lot more ash and clinker, you end up having to stop boilers to clear them a lot more often, which is very horribly dirty and hot and hard work, and limits your ship's speed while that's going on. You actually see this towards the end of the battle in the night actions. A lot of ships have run, especially in the high seas fleet, have run themselves so hard during the day, not clearing everything, because they need to keep their speed up, that by night time, one of the torpedo boat flotillas is told, you need to go and attack, and they point out that actually their boilers are so clogged, they're actually slower than the battleships at that point. They're running at about 16, 17 knots because half their boilers are dead, and they need to start clearing them of this horrible gloopy mess that is the remnants of their coal supplies.
Yeah, that's actually something I didn't know about the battle, and it's quite sobering for that. Basically, this is what happened after basically days steaming. That it was not only the stokers getting tired, but also actually the boilers getting all sorts of all sorts of nasty stuff in them.
Yeah.
You got to think of the
It's
human
not
factors
nice.
there too. In those boiler rooms, especially when you're working this hard, you're going to have temperatures reaching 120 plus degrees Fahrenheit, or I guess in Celsius that would be 45 plus. And it's that, you can only have people in there for so long, and you're having to rotate them in and out just to even get a breath of fresh air, just to keep going, or else they're going to be fainting and you're not going to be able to keep going. So you've got human factors, coal factors, all these working into a terrible mess.
And you're getting through a lot more water because of the needing to give the crews water to help them recover from dehydration, but also the boilers, when they're in such a mess, tend to start using water less efficiently, so they need more, which puts a lot of strain on desalination plants and various other systems that provide you with fresh water, a lot of which had been damaged in action. This is something which would later on in World War II is one of the things which cripples the Graf Spee and stops them being able to really leave Montenegro, because Montevideo. Sorry, I use the country name rather than the place name, don't I? Montevideo, and they, it's one of the things which stops her being able to leave that. The Germans are suffering just the same issues, and one of the things which is going to hold up the Germans actually being able to redeploy for a while after this battle is the need to get spare parts for these desalination plants. Because it's one of those things which is very finicky. They need to be well made. They need to be of certain types to fit. And there ain't many places you can get them from.
Mhm.
We have here a comment from Bruce RKF on Twitch that so far we had a lot of focus on the UK side of the battle. So let's switch to some German-centric questions. First of them is actually from Bruce RKF. Would it have been beneficial for the Germans to leave the slower pre-dreadnoughts at home in this occasion?
Weirdly enough, no.
Yeah,
Believe it or not.
I'm thinking no here.
Yeah. The strange thing is, the pre-dreadnoughts, if they stand in line in the battle, the Germans call them 5-Minuten-Schiff, 5-minute ships. That is probably how long they'll last in a straight-up fight. However, the Battle of Jutland doesn't end up with the Germans in a straight-up fight, and in these particular circumstances, the thing is, for the first and second engagements, they basically have no effect because Scheer runs ahead with the Kaisers and the Königs, and the Helgolands are kind of trying to keep up, not quite, and the Nassaus and the Deutschlands, the pre-dreadnoughts, have just lagged behind. And Scheer just accepts that as the price of doing business. So they don't especially slow the High Seas Fleet down during the kind of the main daylight action. During the night action, I think that there's two things that very strangely enough actually make me come down on the side of they probably were better off having them. One of which is Pommern, whilst its explosion kills an awful lot of German sailors, and that is not obviously anything particularly pleasant, it does mean that it's Pommern, which is a relatively expendable pre-dreadnought, that's eating that torpedo, and not one of the more modern and in most cases quite badly damaged dreadnoughts or battle cruisers. So Pommern's sacrifice probably enables one of the more modern German units to survive. Secondly, is that during the aftermath of the Second Fleet action, when the German battle cruisers are withdrawing after the death ride, Beatty's battle cruisers are pursuing them, and it looks for a moment like Beatty might actually get his revenge, because the German battle cruisers are basically crippled. I think they've got like 4 guns working between the lot of them, and just as it looks like Beatty might be able to crush them before sunset really kicks in, of all things, the pre-dreadnoughts wander out of the mist, and there's about a 5-minute gunfight between the pre-dreadnoughts and the British battle cruisers. The British battle cruisers get the better of it for obvious reasons. The German pre-dreadnoughts withdraw, but it provides just enough of a delay for Hipper's battle cruisers to get out of range and disappear into the murk. And then Beatty realizes he has no idea where the rest of the Germans are, so falls back to where Jellicoe's assigned him. So, oddly enough, those pre-dreadnoughts probably saved the German battle cruisers just by being there.
I think I might take the opposite view of that. I might take the other side of that. I think that bringing those ships, in hindsight, works out pretty well, because of just how the battle is structured, especially around like visibility and how the fleets are arranged and how close they are. But I still come down on the side that it's a mistake to bring them. You know, if you look at it not knowing the future, if you're looking at it on May 30th or whatever, when they make that decision, I'm not sure exactly when that is. I think it presents a lot of risks to the Germans that the British just don't capitalize on. I think it was at Dogger Bank earlier in the war where the Moltke, the battle cruiser, may be the wrong battle there, kind of gets run down by Beatty for this very same reason. Okay, yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. It gets run down in the same scenario where it's just a little bit slower and it gets chased down. And there's a real risk that bringing these older ships, these older, slower ships, could put the Germans in that exact same position without providing a ton of benefit, unless under incredibly ideal circumstances.
Yeah, I broadly agree with that assessment, actually. Yeah, it's one of those things of, before the battle, it makes absolutely no sense. Yeah, I completely agree with Wesley. It's just it's these weird circumstances of the actual how it turns out It's all, I'll end up
Yeah,
justifying it somehow.
It does make a certain sense, though. It does make a certain sense if you consider they're being brought as sacrificial lambs.
I'm
If
not
you
sure the crews
consider
want you to know
the
that.
crews might not want to, and in the nicest way, it's not the nicest way to think it through, but it's how I approach their inclusion entirely. In that they are, to an extent, sacrificial lambs. The death ride at which we talk about the battle cruisers doing was supposed to be done by the pre-dreadnoughts. That's what they were practiced for. Basically, they were brought along as the things which the Germans would quite happily sacrifice if they did find themselves in an ambush. They would sacrifice those to get their dreadnoughts out of the combat. They weren't expecting to protect them like Blucher. They were expecting them to die like Blucher. In a way, they were basically supposed to fulfill the Blucher role, and what Blucher did at Dogger Bank, which was distract the British while the battlecruisers got away. The pre-dreadnoughts were supposed to distract the British while the High Seas Fleet gets away. That's what they were there to die gloriously. That's what they're being brought for. There is a very simple reason. The Germans go, we are outnumbered. There is all sorts of things done with the paper statistics of the various German guns these days, but the Germans weren't obviously expecting their guns to be wonder super weapons that would magically impale all British ships before they managed to pierce their own armor. So
they weren't expecting British ships to explode.
No,
seemingly randomly.
They weren't expecting that one.
Yes.
Honestly, myself, no one's expecting that one on BT. But but leaving that to one side, that's what they're for. They are they are literally there to be brought to protect the High Seas Fleet to get it out of any trouble it gets into. They're sheer insurance policy. They're sheer going, I'm going to be fighting outnumbered. I'm going to be dealing with an enemy which is more numerous and has flexibility. And also, you have to remember, despite the fact being that actually it's the Germans' own radio broadcasting which keeps telling the British what's happening and what's going on, they believe there's spies, aliens. There are so many different ideas about what are telling the British what's going on. At no point, it's kind of like, again, repeated in World War II, at no point do the Germans consider it might be their own radio traffic's been hacked. At no point do they consider they might be tipping off the British themselves. But they're going with it. And taking these ships with them, well, there is part of them which thinks that the Grand Fleet, if they see them going out, will think that it's just them going on an exercise. They're just going out to shoot. That those spies will just inform the whole thing's going out, because surely the British will think there's no way the Germans would actually bring pre-dreadnoughts to fight the mighty Grand Fleet. There's no... Nice way, the mighty Grand Fleet doesn't even have HMS Dreadnought in it anymore, because, frankly, we have so many bigger and better ships than her. That's what the Royal Navy's like. HMS Dreadnought is down leading a Channel squadron of pre-dreadnoughts. So, I suppose the other option is the Germans wanted the British to think that they were going to storm through the Channel and use the pre-dreads as something like the British could have done with the Dardanelles to just soak up mines. But, again, no one thought the British were that insane, or the Germans would be that insane. So,
yeah, I guess if we look at it from the German point of view, so let's say on May 30th, they're making when they're making this decision to bring the pre-dreadnoughts with them, they're looking at this as they're going to be engaging the British battlecruiser fleet, hopefully picking off a few of them and then going home. They're not looking at this as thinking we're going to fight the Grand Fleet and win. And at this time, anytime you have a battle or a major capital ship engagement, it's a numbers game. You want as many guns on your side to mitigate either the superiority of their guns as much as you can, or to have a superiority over your enemy. And so even though that they're pre-dreadnoughts, they only have roughly 4 guns per ship. And even though that they can't salvo fire and do 2 different salvos and all these fancy different firing solutions, there's still more guns on your side. And if you're going to be fighting just the battle cruisers and maybe 5th Battle Squadron, having every little bit helps. And I guess you're not expecting to fight the Grand Fleet.
And I guess, kind of going against my own answer, leaving them in port if the high seas fleet gets, gets beat up pretty bad, is sort of decisively defeated. They're also useless there as well, because it's not like they can do anything solo.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, basically all they would be able to do in such scenario would be basically be a glorified coastal defense ships and basically guard the minefields, but nothing more.
Although I would point out that obviously the Shear doesn't think he's going to run into the Great Fleet.
Yes.
He's doing everything he can to avoid that.
Yeah. So anyway,
he's not an idiot, basically.
No. We had here a question from JB Dang. That was picked by Prince Blip, actually.
Yep.
Where was there any aviation during the period, and was it effective in the battle? So I guess, from the layman's point of view, given the earlier descriptions of the battle, probably not very because of all the weather trouble and low visibility and stuff, but was there, and how did it do?
So the short answer is no, they were not effective. However, there were attempts. So you have the British try to bring along a couple seaplane carriers and HMS Igandine. I'm probably pronouncing that horribly wrong, but manages to launch one plane that does see some things and tries to signal to the fleet, but isn't very impactful and ends up having to ditch into the ocean and wait out the battle, basically just floating there. And they didn't get to do much. The Germans try to bring out some of their Zeppelin recon aircraft on the 31st. However, they have engine problems, and there's also weather problems that keep them from actually being useful, and they end up basically being about 180 to 100 miles to the stern of the high seas fleet. So they're not helpful at all. Gier calls in for recon on June the 1st in the morning. And however, by the time that the Zeppelins actually reach the area and can actually report on anything, the battle is already over. They're already withdrawing, and nothing much is happening there. So the overall outcome is that people are getting an idea of what can be done, but it doesn't have any determined effect. The intel that Shear does get from the Zeppelins on the second day he judges incorrectly. He guesses that a convoy is Harwich Force, if I remember right, and another group of ships he guesses to be the Grand Fleet when it's not the Grand Fleet. So it's pretty inconclusive. There were aircraft there, but they didn't do much.
I think there was a question about the Blackburn.
Yes, there was,
Also,
and I'll bring it
which
up
I'll just
so that we are done with it.
Get it out of the way.
there was a,
Yes.
also a question
so-
about the Blackburn.
Yes. To what extent did technological doctrine / equipment decide the outcome of this battle? And bonus question: how much more would the Royal Navy win if they would have access to the Blackburn? So I guess the first part was picked by Wesley. So
I'll let this Blackburn thing get out of the way first. That needs to get off the table before we can continue.
yes.
Right then. So, how much would the RN, if they had the Blackburn, that would have meant they'd have had a working carrier of that vintage, which would have come with torpedo bombers and fighters. So, if you had a spotting aircraft like a Blackburn, which was actually a fairly good aerial command and control aircraft for this sort of scenario, that would certainly have made a difference to Jellicoe's ability to track the Germans and to maintain watch on them, and also to peer over smoke screens. He'd have also had torpedo bombers. And even a small group of torpedo bombers at this time could have been fairly devastating, because the Germans, as they were running away after their fleet sort of is trying to go away under the attack, could have themselves been attacked by torpedo bombers. And if any of their ships had been damaged or that had slowed down the force at all, that would have been a major problem. But this is the whole thing. If you have a carrier, it's like another question I think said, what would happen if they were World War II ships? And, once you're getting that level of technology along, it turns into a very different battle. It turns into a far more deadly battle in many ways, because you have carrier aviation on one side or the other, you have a far larger, far grander in many ways versions of Matapan. The interesting thing, just before Wesley gets into it, because I know he's going to, but with the technological doctrine and equipment, the big lesson for the British that's taken after this is the need to learn to fight at night. And you have to admit that even 6 months later, but certainly by a year later, if Jutland had repeated a year later, and it had involved the night actions like Jutland had involved, it would have been very, very different for the Germans, because the British would have had practiced night fighting to as great an extent as any navy could possibly do at this point. And that's the advantage the British have with airspace, is they do have more areas to practice, more areas to train than the Germans do. And that would have been a completely different scenario. It's one of the British realized very quickly that where they had presumed that night fighting had been to an extent made very individualistic by the advancing of technology, and their exercises had suggested that pre-war, their wartime experience shows that actually no, it requires cooperation, but cooperation of a different kind. And in World War II, that's why you see it where the battleship which has radar is the battleship which also turns on its searchlights to illuminate the targets, so the other battleships don't have to turn on their searchlights and just can merrily blast away. And, that's the sort of thing which the British start to develop immediately after Jutland. It's one of the first things they start doing is going, oh, sugar, we need to be able to do this. Mm-hmm. And they do it.
Yeah, so just from a technology perspective, we already kind of touched on this earlier, but Jutland happens at kind of an interesting point in history where a lot of the technologies that are being worked with in the two fleets are relatively new in terms of naval combat, right? So the technology from the two sides is not drastically different. There are advantages some sides have, the coal and other things, and they've made different decisions about how to apply that technology in some cases. The British have chosen bigger guns and the Germans have more armor and things like that. But there's not a drastic difference. But what you see is that there's a whole lot of innovations that have happened in terms of ship design, construction, and propulsion and armaments. The engagement ranges are something that somebody 20 years before could never have dreamed of. And it's very difficult for the people in charge of these fleets, you're looking at your admirals, your vice admirals, to apply those technologies to solve some of the problems that those same technologies have sort of brought into play, right? And actually, Dr. Clark touched on this as well. The increase in speed of these ships and the ability of coal-powered steam engines and oil, in some cases, with the Queen Elizabeths, has made ship mobility greater than it ever has been. And so as you're trying to engage a fleet, if that fleet feels threatened, if that fleet thinks it cannot win, like the Germans think right from the beginning, basically, if they run into the Grand Fleet, there's very limited ways to stop them from running away. Your only hope is to be a little bit faster and hit in just the right spots to slow them down. And so that means if this battle happens later in history, if you're looking at, Second World War, early Second World War ships, you probably don't have this problem because you can chase them down. That's, they chase down the Bismarck and things like that. Specifically because they had tools available to force an engagement on the enemy if they really needed to. And that's really not present at Jutland. Another one is the radio, which is incredibly important in terms of sharing information when you choose to transmit that information before anybody jumps in about Beatty. But even that, has problems. Ships lose their radios during the fighting. In the same way they lose their desalinization plants, they lose their radio transmitters. Or they're still stuck using signal flags for a lot of ship-to-ship communication, which Admiral Nelson could probably read just fine if you put the signals up in front of him. And so there's this sort of mix of old and new, and then also not having the new things that would be invented a decade later that turns it into a completely different battle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
I do like the point though that you basically just agreed with me and Drac on BT not being able to communicate there. We do accept the support.
We had some communication challenges.
To be fair to BD, at least on the radio point, at some point in the battle, BD, their Lion's radio gets taken out, and he's having to relay messages to Dubuck in Princess Royal in order to get anything out. So.
Also,
Which again, it's an
Got
improvement.
to be fair, a little bit fair. It's an improvement. He's communicating to somebody else in his unit.
I just want to throw
Okay.
out there that these guys trying to read these flags at thousands of yards away sometimes, going at over 20 knots, they are. That sounds like a huge challenge.
Yes.
That sounds almost as challenging as hitting a ship with a gun from that far away.
It is, as is being an admiral and making sure they go up in the right order and they're brought down in the right order when you're executing orders. It's just terrible. Although no, that's not from 1,000 yards. That's from about 2 yards away, and it's right next to your admiral's deck. So
Yeah, this is one of the things. It's two-part. One is don't send confusing signals. The other part is make sure you actually execute those signals properly, because those of you who might, in the audience, who might not understand, in the Royal Navy and indeed in most navies of the time, if you hoist a flag signal, that is not actually an order to do something. That is basically a FYI, pay attention to this. You then haul the signal flags down. That is the order to execute. This is what gets 5th Battle Squadron so heavily shot up at what they call Windy Corner, because BT has the signal to do a 180 turn up. He just never orders it to come down. So Evan Thomas is sat there going, I'm waiting. Why is everything exploding? Blow this for a laugh. I'm going home.
It's sort of it's. There are many good things you can say about BT. He looks debonair in a photo. He does really look that, and no one else can stick their hands in their pockets quite the same way as he can. But as an admiral, he leaves a lot to be desired. He really does.
Yes. We had actually, touching on the previous discussion about the technology improvements, we had another question from the King family. I guess that's not royal family, but still. The aftermath of the battle, what advanced changes and lessons did both nations learn from the battle that led to them creating an advanced versions of their naval programs? And I just realized we covered a lot of that, like the night fighting doctrine for the Royal Navy. But for the German side, I can't get rid of the remark that went on in our Doggerbang discussion about the downside of the German naval rangefinders, that they were very precise but caused terrible migraines to their crews. Was this perhaps why before World War II the German radar research was so much focusing on getting the SETACT at getting a very good range finding radar instead of search radar or something? Was that basically reaction to the...
It was part of that motivation, because the thing was the coincidence rangefinders that most everyone else was using. The Germans really didn't like those because they could be fooled by disruptive camouflage and all sorts of fancy things like the triangles you sometimes see attached to masts, which is what the British were using. They put on all this effort to try and confuse the German rangefinders. As it turns out, stereoscopic rangefinders don't care. But the Germans knew this. That's one of the reasons why they were using stereoscopic rangefinders in the first place. So they didn't want to go away from them, but they also had an inkling of just how taxing they could be on their crews, which was part of the motivation for why they drove radar research so hard. A couple of the things we haven't covered from both sides in terms of advancements that follow the battle. After a lot of back and forth internally over exactly why the battle cruisers had this horrible habit of exploding, whilst the public story is very different, and you see this still repeated a lot in some circles about thin armor and such like, internally the Admiralty's pretty much narrowed it down to the ammunition handling procedures within the space of a few months after Jutland, and they go absolutely paranoid about it thereafter. They sweep out the turrets, they sweep out the working chambers, they massively restrict and in a lot of cases reinstate policies that had been in existence before, back when everyone was absolutely paranoid about magazine safety, back when black powder was used. Everyone had got a little bit lax, partly because they thought cordite was more stable. Turns out, shockingly not. So you had this massive advance in flash safety, which, weirdly enough, by the time you get to World War II, they've probably actually gone slightly overboard on it. Because one of the little-known things is that when you get to the Battle of Denmark Strait, at least 50%, if not more, of the problems that Prince of Wales has firing its guns are not so much the guns themselves or even the turrets themselves. It's actually the flash protection, and the tightness of tolerances on the ammunition supply system are so tight that the slightest flex and bend of the ship, which of course you're going to get traveling around at high speed, is enough to warp the ship just enough to jam the ammunition feeds until it sorts itself back out again, which slightly lesser tolerances wouldn't have done. But the British by that point are so paranoid about flash protection, they won't accept that until it turns out is basically you have to dial it back just a fraction, or else your guns won't work. On the German side of things, Scheer writes a note back to Kaiserliche Marine HQ that basically says, 1, I never want to do that again. 2, if you're going to make me do that again, I want much bigger guns. Much bigger guns.
And more of them.
Yeah. So this is why you see, obviously, you have the Bayerns or Bardens, depending on what you want to call them. They have 15-inch guns, but whereas the British have gone 12-inch, 13.5-inch, 15-inch, they're still thinking mostly about 15-inch for most of the First World War. With the Germans, they've gone 11 to 12. Then to 15, and as they're planning it, the Bardens will be the only German battleship class of the First World War they're planning with 15-inch guns. They immediately go to 16.5-inch guns for the L-20E Alphas, and the Mackensons are planned with, I think it's 13. I can't remember, 13.4, 13.8, something like that.
Yeah.
Some 13 point something. Yeah, 350mm guns. And as a result, again, of Scheer's note basically saying, no, I want much bigger guns, they actually replan the last few Mackensons, and they become the Ersatz Yorks with 15-inch guns, and this is for the battle cruisers. So the Germans basically learned the lesson of, no, you can't get away with small guns, you need really, really big guns.
Yep. I guess another thing that Germany kind of learns that they need to keep an eye on is underwater safety. Especially with the loss of Lützow, how they knew what was going on, and they knew the source of the damage and why that was a weakness. And this ends up saving, I believe it's Kaiser itself in Operation Albion later, where they run into several, basically they run into Russian minefields, and several German ships are saved because of improved damage control practices, basically in regards to fighting underwater threats. So that's another thing that they learn.
They do learn that, but you have to push forward with the technology in some respects of what they learn. And I would say one of the other things that comes through quite strongly, and this goes through into the gun debate, this goes through into the other sort of discussions going back, they learned the importance of the new ships. And they want to put resources in them. And I think one of the reasons why the German fleet, it does go to sea again. There's often this idea after Jutland they never go to sea again. They do wander to sea. They do operations. But they don't do operations on the same scale because they're waiting for those new ships. They want those new ships. And they're planning for those new ships. The sad thing is, they don't get new ships. They really don't. Very few ships, I think it's possibly one, is completed after Jutland. I'm not sure. There might be a second one. My brain sometimes gets a bit iffy on the exact timetables of them. But the British are building not just new ships coming into service after Jutland, some which are upgraded. They have all sorts of new ships coming into service. They have Renown and Repulse coming into service. They have the remainder of the Queen of the R class, the battleships coming into service. They have Hood started, built mostly during World War One, and then stopped, then finished off afterwards. But that's the advantage the British have. And this goes back to the whole thing at the beginning. The British have a lot more resources and will always get a lot more resources for their navy because of the nature of power in Britain, of the nature of the navy's status, the nature of the navy's role. And that's ultimately, when you come back to it, you start there going, well, the Germans' plans for building a navy, their stated reasons for building a navy, actually do provoke, arguably, the British to getting involved in the Entente, which leads to war as it was happening. And they might have been better off spending those resources on more artillery, some more machine guns, and maybe some more railways so they can more rapidly move their troops. Maybe they should have sponsored a few railways going through Belgium into France. That might have been a good idea, and a fair number of railways they could quickly secure going straight to Paris through Belgium.
Also, just with the influence of Jutland on a kind of short and long term, I have no idea on the statistics of the man hours spent studying Jutland in naval academies around the world after 1916, but my guess is it is a huge number, a huge percentage of the number as well. So I think it's incredibly impactful, and if I remember correctly, it also the experience is not just from Jutland, but from the First World War, also impacted how people were doing armor layouts on battleships. Right, I believe that's the sort of the root of the more citadel-y nature of battleships, which I think is an important part of the evolution of the designs during the interwar period.
Yeah, the Americans have already got on the trend of this with the all or nothing armor scheme introduced on the Nevada class, or apparently, I guess, well, there's two of you here. I'm told it's the Nevada class, actually.
It depends on where you are in the U.S. You're
fair enough. So they've introduced this. Everyone else is kind of still using the distributed armor scheme, but one of the things that Jutland shows up is that the reason for the distributed armor scheme is kind of a holdover from the pre-dreadnought period when everyone was thinking there might be a hail of small caliber HE shells, and Jutland illustrates that pretty much that is not going to happen in a straight up battleship gunfight. So all of this lighter, thinner armor around the ship actually serves very little purpose. At best, it's dead weight. At worst, it's actually initiating the fuses on shells that might otherwise go straight through the ship. And it's taking up weight that could be devoted into either having thicker main belt armor or more expansive main belt armor. And so you see the changeover by the time you get to the early 1920s. The ships are being built for the Washington Naval Treaty. Pretty much everybody else has adopted this all or nothing armor scheme, with the exception of the Germans, which is a little bit odd because they really could benefit from it. It's one of the things you sometimes see people go, oh, well, the German battle cruisers have main armor belt thickness that's just as good as British battle cruisers. It's like, it's technically true. But go and have a look at the cross sections. Almost all ships of World War I at this point, they have main belt, and then they have an upper strake, which is thinner, and then they have an upper strake above that, which is thinner still. On an actual battleship, whether that be a Kaiser, a Koenig, a Helgoland, a Iron Duke, that main belt height is about usually either the same as or just a little bit higher than the sloped up part of the deck that makes up the deck armor. So that slope is protected against horizontal and near horizontal fire, because that's a vulnerable part. And then you have an upper strake and upper strake. On the German battle cruisers, whilst they do have sort of 11.8, 12-inch thick belts, that's about half, 2/3 of the height, which means that the upper part of that sloped side, which of what we call turtleback armor, is exposed, or it's protected by the thinner strake, which is usually around about 8 inches thick, which means that in a normal gunfight, a 13.5 or 15-inch shell that has a working fuse will go straight through that 8-inch belt like it's not even there. It will hit this very sloped part of the deck, which is now pretty much almost vertical to it and is only a few inches thick. Also not going to stop it. And then it'll go inside, and then suddenly magazines and engines and other things you really don't want to have an armor-piercing shell introduced to are in small fragments. The Germans are generally very lucky at Jutland for the most part, because of those faulty British shells, it means they don't end up experiencing this. But given the distribution of hits on a lot of the German battlecruisers, they very well could have those fuses work better. Which technically, I suppose, is kind of playing a long game by the Germans, since the reason most of the British fuses don't work very well is because back at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, British shells used Krupp fuses because they were the best ones that were out there. And then the Germans stopped selling them to the British. And then the British had to suddenly do a crash course in, oh yeah, how do we actually make a working fuse for an armor-piercing shell?
How
Which,
to make this work?
yeah, they don't quite get right in time for Jutland.
Which actually leads to a question from Argodoc from before the stream, which touches the thing that is often a misconception about the battle. I read that the English had only HE to arm their fleet, high explosive. German heavy ships were badly burned but returned to port. Would AP shells have sunk the German fleet? So I guess
I'll take it away on this one because
Yes.
Jack has elaborated a little bit on it. So the British warships absolutely had AP with them. APC shells Mark II-A, if I remember right. And they were firing them through their whole battle. The problem with the British AP fuse shell or AP shells was they had a more or less two problems. One was the fuses that Jack mentioned, as well as the burster they were using, which is largely lyddite, was overly sensitive to impact. And so whenever they were hitting German armor plates or even other German plates, they would essentially shake and have an HE-like effect. That was not, it was an explosion, but it wasn't like a detonation that they were expecting to have. And it was happening outside the ship or within the belt of the ship. And so it was, so to the Germans, it felt like HE. To the British, it felt like nothing was working. And later on, after the battle, this gets fixed with the Green Boy shell, which is the Mark IV shell, and which begins a whole spiral of highly effective long fuse shells that extends into World War II and gets only better and better, essentially. If I remember right, Jellicoe was aware of issues with the shell before the war, but was, and I think that was when he was Third Sea Lord, but he wasn't able to actually get things going to fix the problems. And so, bit the British in the butt a little bit there.
They had a plan to fix it, but then World War One happened.
Yeah.
It's one of those things. It's kind of like in 1939. Britain has a lot of plans for modernising its fleet air arm, and then bringing in new generations of aircraft, because it's aircraft that's got the 1936 generation. It's just about to bring in the 1940 etc. generation, and then World War II happens, and that slows things up. It's the same with the shells. They have plans for them. It's just World War One happens, and you have what you have, and you go with it, and you try and get as many of it as you can.
Jellicoe actually has a nearly complete set of prototype fuses that are much better when he's Third Sea Lord, but he gets moved off from being First Sea Lord immediately before the war, and his successor basically pays next to zero attention to any of the handover notes, and so the whole project stalls out. Which is one of the reasons why the Green Boys get rolled out remarkably quickly in terms of shell development time, because Jellicoe can, at that point, eventually basically turn around and say, look, most of the work is already there. Take this, develop it more, and so you actually get the Green Boys, as I turned around quite quickly. The other interesting thing which relates to this is that all of this is actually the root cause of why the British overestimate quite significantly how many German ships have sunk by the end of the Battle of Jutland, because they are expecting AP shells to hit a ship, to go inside a ship, to explode inside a ship, and unless you hit a magazine or something equally spectacular, you're not going to see all that much. You might see a flash, you might see a bit of smoke, but you're not expecting to see a tremendous amount of actual damage, say, unless the magazine goes up. What they actually see is, as Prince Flip said, they see the shells go in, they see them smash. Well, they don't see them smash, but they see this big fireball come off of the side of the German ship and lots of smoke. And to the British observers, knowing that they're firing AP shells, this seems to indicate catastrophic levels of damage because the only way you should theoretically get a huge fireball and a plume of smoke from an AP shell hit is if you've really broken something inside. This is coupled with the fact that because of needing to go through the Kiel Canal, unlike the Panama Canal, where you're limited more by your width, the Kiel Canal is limited more by your depth. So the German ships tend to be somewhat wider and somewhat shallower draft, which means when they make a hard turn, they tend to lean over quite a bit more than average. And obviously Scheer does this twice. So what the British see is they see the lead German ships hit by shells, they see these spectacular fireballs and smoke plumes, and whilst this is going on, they see the German ships turn, and they see the German ships turn with this horrific, to them, list. And so they're putting two and two together in their heads and thinking, right, we've seen catastrophic damage, and as the Germans are turning away, they're healing really badly, they must be suffering from catastrophic flooding. There's absolutely no way a ship that's been hit that badly and is listing that badly at this point could possibly survive, therefore it must be sunk. It must have just gone off and died somewhere in the mist, we didn't see it. And so when they collate all these reports, they think they've sunk half a dozen German capital ships, when in fact what they've done is, for most part, actually scorched the paintwork on the outside. They have actually done some fairly serious damage to certain ships, but a lot of that is to the upper works and not to the watertight integrity.
Right.
And I think we should just give a name to a certain Sea Lord. The gentleman who takes over after Jellicoe is a gentleman called Charles Briggs, who ends up in charge of 4th Battle Squadron at the Battle of Jutland. So, he does that, but he retires in 1917. A good sign, which of course happens to all good admirals. A good admiral is always allowed to retire in the middle of a world war. It's what all navies allow to happen. He's followed by a gentleman called Lionel Halsey, who is... he's followed by Gordon Moore, who is fairly decent, but he's only in charge 1912 to 1914, who's then followed by Frederick Tudor, who is another interesting soul, who does manage to reach the rank of admiral and does stay in the Royal Navy, but he's made president of the Royal Naval College in 1920, being promoted there by Beatty as being someone of excellent academic and wonderful naval skill. I won't say what Admiral Richmond, the noted naval historian of the period, calls him, because that's rude and unrepeatable on a YouTube channel and Twitch broadcast, unless we've got a PG-18 rating. But yes, it is kind of interesting in that the Royal Navy does oscillate between having some very decent to having some very problematic third Sea Lords at this period. Gordon Moore is actually also more famously remembered as Vice Admiral Sir David Beatty's second in command at the Battle of Dogger Bank, where he was trying to deal with Beatty. And in 1917, for his sins, he's made control of the Mechanical Warfare Department, which basically means he gets charged with developing tanks. He has fun with that, but no, he is interesting. The Royal Navy has an interesting run of third Sea Lords, and none of them are in service for that long. If you think about it, they've all been in service 2 years or less, even during wartime, and this means that they have a lot of trouble with institutional memory with third Sea Lords and passing things on.
I guess,
it's one of the interesting things in the run-up of World War II. The Royal Navy has the same third Sea Lord for 6 years, which means he does get to do a lot of development and a lot of changes. Third Sea Lord is responsible for all the building, all the construction, all development of the Navy, basically the building the ships for the future wars. That's why you tend to put in a bright officer. You tend to put in the officer who's going to be the admiral in charge of those ships, so he builds the ships he wants and then goes out and leads them in a battle. That's what Jellicoe does. Some of the ones who aren't there, who are after him and before him, are I'm not quite sure how they got to third Sea Lord. I really don't know. There's one called Lionel Halsey, which I really don't understand. But no. Anyway, they are. The point is that being third Sea Lord is an important role. and the Royal Navy wouldn't have got where it was without the Third Sea Lords being good. But you do have a problem in the transition. And the point is, Fisher has developed these things, and Jellicoe has developed and sorted out these things for the Shells in 1910. Think about that when the Battle of Jutland happens. He has that all sitting there in 1910. And then, of course, he gets heavily involved in pushing the Queen Elizabeth class through, even though he's not Third Sea Lord, but that's because his successors are really not that good at their jobs.
Yep. I think we can move on to a question from Hetman Mazepa, which is very long, so I'm sorry I won't be reading it in whole. But I mean, I guess he will get soon to get his Tribal Darings and so on book.
It's supposed to be coming out later this year.
Yep.
They're talking about a book tour, actually, which will be fun.
Oh, that should be fun, yeah. Stop in Prague. Yeah, basically his question could be boiled down to how much political pressure was Admiral Scheer under, and the High Seas Fleet in general. How much pressure were they under, given up until 1916, basically, a lot of people in Germany felt that basically army is doing all the hard work and the navy is just sitting in port and sailing sometimes to shell some coastal villages. So how much did this play into the Battle of Jutland?
I guess I'll start with that. There is a certain amount of political pressure, but at the same time, the Kaiser is incredibly precious about what he views as his fleet. He does not want his fleet to be destroyed, so no matter what other, as far as he's concerned, lesser mortals might think, he wants his fleet to ideally be victorious, if not at least remain intact. He does not want to lose it. And there's a certain amount of strategic sense in that as well. To be honest, I think, at least from my reading, the single greatest source of pressure within the High Seas Fleet to go out and actually do something is from the High Seas Fleet officers themselves. Hipper has been in charge of the battle cruisers for a fair bit of time, and they've seen the most action. But the High Seas Fleet before Scheer has been under the charge of Admirals Ingerholl and von Poll, both of which have been fairly conservative, one of which was very timid, and the captains and the various lower-ranking admirals and even the sailors in the fleet are really, to be honest, quite fed up of that kind of command style. So Scheer is much more dynamic, he's much more active, and to be honest, he's a far, far, far better admiral than either Ingerholl or von Poll could ever dream of being. He is a superb admiral. And this whole expedition that results in the Battle of Jutland is largely his work, and to be honest, in large part because he knows that a lot of the officers and men of the High Seas Fleet want to be at least seen to be doing something, if nothing else. And I think this is one of the things I do try and emphasize as much as possible where it's due. Hipper and Scheer are not bad admirals. They are both actually excellent admirals. If they were in the Royal Navy, you could quite easily see them being on the other side of things. You could quite easily see someone of Scheer's caliber being appointed to command of the Grand Fleet. You could easily, I mean, Hipper, to be honest, is a far, far better admiral at sea than Beatty ever will be. So they are excellent admirals. The fact that they didn't come away with an overwhelming victory is more the fact that they've been dealt a very short hand in terms of numbers of ships and the intel that's working against them. The fact that Scheer gets all of his dreadnought battleships home, given the circumstances, a lesser admiral would not have managed that. A lesser admiral would have come away with half his ships sunk and the rest of them on fire. Mm-hmm. And the men know that as well.
They are very, very good admirals. And that is an advantage the Germans do certainly have. I honestly do think that if you wanted to put the scariest combination you could imagine from World War I in terms of commanders together, if you put Jellicoe and Scheer in charge of a force with Scheer possibly as second in command, just because Jellicoe seems to have slightly more luck, and I do like to have my admirals in charge being lucky because it does help. And let's be honest, crossing the T twice, that was good skill on Jellicoe's part, but also a lot of luck. A lot of luck going into that one. So, yes, I think a sheer Jellicoe combination could probably have taken over the world with just half a dozen ships. But leaving that to one side, you also have to remember both sides have far more admirals than the two big names. And one of the questions I often get by students is, what are those admirals doing? Why do you have all these battle squadrons under the command of admirals and second and deputy commanders who are also admirals? And why do you have all these senior officers around? And it's because commanding these formations is a very, very delicate and very complicated task, and it does require a lot of people. If you consider, when we're talking about a modern division, a modern fighting division, that will maybe have 30,000, 40,000 personnel in it, but it will usually have 1 2-star and 3 to 4 1-star generals in it. That's what it's normally is, sort of its terms of general officers. Sometimes they'll even have the brigades run by colonels rather than 1-stars, brigadiers.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about a naval force from this period, the amount of destructive power they have in their capabilities and the amount of skill that they require to operate in understanding the sea, and then there's, in case of ships going up, because, again, unlike with a land formation, there really is no safe space for an admiral. An admiral is on the same front line, facing the same risks as their sailors, as everyone in these fights.
Yeah, and
At that point, you can lose them, and so you have a lot more senior officers and a lot more admirals, and they have a role. And the communications between those admirals can be a factor. And I would say the biggest advantage with Hipper over Beatty is his communication ability, but also the fact he does get to know his other admirals. He does go and talk to them. And of course, with the Royal Navy, they actually have a third force commander there. They have the Grand Fleet, which is commanded by Jellicoe and has all his admirals in. You have BT, which is technically part of the Grand Fleet, but there's also its own sort of independent force, battlecruiser force. And then you have Twit's force. You have this force of cruisers and destroyers from Harwich, which are there. And frankly, again, there's another officer who, if you could have replaced BT with him, you would have had a very different battle.
Yeah, you got to keep in mind these lower rear admirals that are managing like the units underneath BD and such. They have to be on the ball just as much, if not even more so, than these force leaders. Because if they mess up and they lead their unit away from where the big admiral is trying to get them to go, then they're on their own, and they can very easily mess up and become the focus of all the attention. And so like these guys are having just as much of an important role as the decision makers in terms of following and making sure that everybody else is following where they're going.
And
making sure they don't run into anything.
Yeah.
Like other
Yes.
ships.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they have also kind of responsibility also to filter the superiors' commands so that if it seems like it's not going to end up well, they do something and they have authority to try to do something, at least for their squadron to like not really run into disaster. Again, referring to Ivan Thomas, I guess, in this battle. But throughout the discussion, we several times mentioned crossing in the T, and Nyarlathotep V1 was asking why crossing the T is so important. So I will... oh, wait, wrong picture. I will add in this little map because there you can basically see what happened when the T was crossed. What happened is basically that the side
Could you
that
go
is...
back to the picture of Agincourt? Because I think that explains it better.
Yes. Basically, what happens when you cross the T of an enemy fleet means that basically you open up your broadsides. You can see the Agincourt here with its 7 turrets. if you open up the broadside, you have all the 7 turrets have clear field of fire. Your enemy who is sailing
And-
towards you can shoot only with their front turrets, and even then, not necessarily all of them, because the ships that are in front may block the shots of the ships that are behind them. So in theory, crossing the T means that basically all your guns can fire and can absolutely deluge the enemy fleet in shells, while the enemy can fire at best half of their guns, which is generally not a sensible trade-off.
Yeah, the other thing is to bear in mind is the mechanics of the shell ballistics, in that when a shell falls, quite often the sort of scatter when it is in an ellipse, and that ellipse is usually towards you and away from you, not horizontal. So if a ship is heading towards you, more of that ship falls within the ellipse of your gunfire falling than it does if it's horizontal, if it's sideways to you. And the other thing is, with the fire control systems, if your ships are parallel, the speeds are not going to be exactly the same, but you have to, bearing in mind at this point there's no radar, you have to estimate that difference in speed and plug that into your fire control equipment to then give you the solution. And if you get it slightly wrong, even by half a knot, given that you've got 30 seconds or so of shell flight time, that might be enough to make the shells miss left or right. Whereas if a ship's coming pretty much dead at you, there is no deflection change other than your own ship, which is obviously moving across the field of battle. And you know what that speed is because it's your own ship, so you can put that in. All you have to worry about is the rate of closing, and that's much easier to estimate with the rangefinders. So everything that Taki said is absolutely true. And additional to that, you actually have ballistic benefits for your guns as well.
To add to a similar question, because I mean it was quite a feat for Jellicoe and quite a big deal of luck to be able to cross the T not once but twice. There was a question: what would have happened if Jellicoe deployed his fleet to starboard instead of to port into the battle line? If we look at the
Give me a moment while I try to picture the map in my head for
There
a
you go.
second. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So there's. I mean, I did look at this when I was doing my Jutland video series, and I'm sure Wesley will have a few more things to add. But basically, there's kind of I guess there's a best case and a worst case. Best case scenario: if Jellicoe deploys his fleet in the opposite direction, you basically get what's called a passing engagement. So the two fleets are having a full-on broadside engagement, but the two fleets are sailing past each other. That kind of still favours the British a little bit because they have more ships, but in the initial opening stages of that passing engagement, it's Vanguard versus Vanguard, which means that the number of ships is actually equal. So both the front ends of both sides' fleets are going to get utterly chewed up. And that is going to be a major problem for both sides, because as ships at the lead start to get hit, start to fall out of line, that disrupts the formation behind and everything starts to break down. But the British have more ships to throw into that, so they've got a slight advantage. That's kind of the best case. The worst case is, depending on when this turn is made, Jellicoe could very well end up sailing off to the southwest and completely miss the High Seas fleet. At which point, he keeps sailing forward. Then everyone has to try and figure out how you get round to re-engaging, which could be something of an interesting issue. But more to the point, if neither side engages thereafter, and this kind of comes down to what we'll talk about later about who won. If neither side engages after the run to the south and the run to the north, it's a clear German victory. Because the British have sunk nothing at this point, apart from maybe a handful of light craft. And that would have some interesting effects, I would say, on the general morale of the Royal Navy. If the two main fleets never see each other and you're just left with half the battle cruiser fleet thanks to BT.
Well, in which case that would make it kind of easy for the British to get rid of BT. He would be gone within like 5 minutes.
True.
And in other good news, we would have had Hood still alive, so he could have been used to replace BT. which would have given the battlecruiser, and it might well have emboldened the Germans to come out. In which case, there could have been another follow-on battle, where there would have been a far better battlecruiser fleet commander in place, who would have communicated. So yeah, that's a bad. I'm trying to remember why that's a bad history. That a bad for history that didn't happen.
Yeah.
Trying to thinking hard.
Yeah, I guess you still have to hope that the German Navy comes out after even such a relatively small battle.
The reason they do come out is because they don't come out again is because they have been damaged quite badly in terms of their forces by those crossing the T's. It's the sheer amount of damage, the time it takes to repair those ships, and waiting for newer ships. If you haven't had that experience, if all you've had is the experience of destroying 2 of the Royal Navy battle cruisers, and all that success, then you are emboldened by your success, and you've not been damaged.
Yeah.
Especially since your own battle cruisers would have came out of that exchange in fairly good shape, because they suffered probably most serious damage at the later stages of the battle, when they had basically everyone shooting at them. So
Yeah.
The other impact, of course, would be renown and repulse would be accelerated something absurd at that point. So you would end up with whoever was commanding the battle cruiser fleet for the British would end up with 2 15-inch armed battle cruisers with fairly decent armor for battle cruisers, for British-style battle cruisers, and that could have had an interesting effect in a run to the south scenario. If you have those there, if you have very much faster, very heavily armed, latest weaponry. Admittedly, they have treble 4-inch guns on them for their sort of secondary weaponry on them, but we'll leave that to one side. We'll try and ignore the treble 4-inch guns.
Yeah. So since our time is kind of filling up, I will now go for a bonus question from Hetman Mazepa before we go to the big question. And that is, in the opinion of the panelists, what is their recommendation of the best 1-volume book on this battle? He had so far at Massey's Castles of Steel. So, best book. Let's start from Wesley.
I'm gonna go with I'm gonna go with not just specifically about this battle. And I'm gonna go with Rules of the Game by Andrew Gordon. So it covers a lot of the evolution of the Royal Navy before the war. One of the things about navies that actually both Dreckenfell and Dr. Clark mentioned earlier is that the ships the Germans had at the beginning of the war were mostly what they had at the end, and it was the same for the British. And so because of the length of naval construction times, the cost, the materials needed for all these ships, during the war, the admirals and the navies were kind of just stuck with the decisions that were made upwards of a decade ago. And so Rules of the Game kind of tracks the evolution of British naval thinking in the early years of the 20th century, as well as more time than you would ever expect on signals and how they talked between ships, and a lot about the kind of thing that we discussed earlier with the follow the order no matter what, even if you run into another ship, or the sort of beady style of, I'm going to give you an idea, kind of try and follow, please.
So the rules of the game.
It does also talk about Jutland. I should point out that it has several chapters on Jutland itself, but it also has a big chunk about sort of before the war.
Yeah.
I have to say it was entertaining to see the scramble for the bookshelves.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
I guess. So actually, I'll say, I you build me as a possible BD defender. I will also be an ebook defender. All my books right here on my telephone. It's fantastic. I recommend it.
Yeah,
So I
the
see.
ebooks are lovely, but they don't smell the same.
Yes. So,
Gorgeous.
what is Dr. Clark's
This is the
recommendation?
Jutland Scandal: The Truth About the First World War's Greatest Sea Battle, written by Vice Admiral John Harper and Admiral Reginald Bacon. Now, it's their two accounts, and these are the two people who actually wrote. In the case of Harper, he wrote the redacted, hidden, rewritten report by Beatty. So that's his whole report is The Truth About Jutland, which is the first half of this book. And then there is the section written by Admiral Sir Reginald Bacon, which is all about the Jutland scandal, which goes through all the follow-ups after the Battle of Jutland and what happened in the Navy to cover up what happened and what went wrong and what lessons were actually had to be learnt. And it's really very good. It has sections on Dogger Bank as well, and a whole appendix which is a synopsis of losses. It's really an ultimate book, and this actually version is published by Skyhorse Publishing in 2016. I forget how much it was. I don't think it was that much. And it's a really, really good book, and I really recommend it because these were the people who were there at the time writing about it. So it's not necessarily a historian's account who's had years to process it, put everything in context and think it through, which I love selling because after all, that's what I produce. And, I can look at it from 100 years hence and go, yes, this is what it all fits in. This is the actual officers who were there at the time, who were in charge of writing the reports, of assessing what was going on, writing and discussing it and explaining it. Bacon was, of course, at this point, was in charge of the Dover Patrol. And after World War I, he's absolutely incensed by Beatty writing the Dover Patrol out of history and trying to turn the Jutland into this grandiose battle where Beatty saves the day and nothing else the Navy's doing around the world matters. And Bacon basically goes to war with Beatty, and there is a debate over whether Beatty or Bacon wins. In World War II, the Royal Navy implements convoys, has carriers, all sorts of things, and has won the fight to get back control of naval aviation. These were all things which BT gave up and didn't think were going to be necessary in future warfare. So I'll let you work out who I think wins that battle.
Okay. And
this is a very, very good book.
Right.
Yeah.
So my choice, well, I'm going to slightly cheat, and I'm going to say, right, if you want a foundation that goes through the battle almost blow by blow, and has a lot of technical information, then although it's slightly old at this point, Jutland, an analysis of the fighting by Campbell, remains one of the foundational works for as I say, it's old, but very few can claim to have done anything better than him at this point. On the other hand, if that's not the kind of sort of one volume approach that appeals to you, if you want to get a feel of what Jutland was actually like for the people who were there, then this would be my choice. This is Voices from Jutland, a centenary commemoration. And those of you regular viewers of my channel will know I really like hearing from people who were physically there. And it's not the world's thickest book, so you can get through it relatively quickly, but it contains quite a lot of different accounts and statements from people who were actually on the ships fighting, and in some cases ending up in the water, as to what happened there. So yeah, Campbell would be for your, now I know intricately how all the ships maneuvered, who sunk what, etc., etc. This book gives you an idea of what it was actually like to be there on the day.
Okay, thank you. And Principally.
So I am also on the ebook side of things, mostly because whenever I moved from the US, I could not bring so many books with me and had to learn how to ebook very quickly. But the book that I would choose is if you want to know more about like what the ships were, what their parameters were, and how well they stood up to damage, and how well they sailed, and all these sort of things. You can't do much better than The Grand Fleet by David K. Brown, he's writing much later on, but he was a naval architect, very much involved with developing British warships in the 50s onwards. and so he knows his stuff, and he has access to resources and institutional knowledge that a lot of other historians didn't get access to, and has a lot of insight onto like why protected cruisers seem to hold up better than armored cruisers, and a lot of these weird questions that came out of the battle and how Britain evolved from them. So it's definitely The Grand Fleet by David K. Brown would be my recommendation.
Well, thank you for recommendations. I actually did not read any of these books, so I'm going to rate all possible. Well, because also ebooks for the win, because they are easier to read in the subway and in the bus.
I think you can get this on ebook, but I do still stand by the professional hardbacks. But I also think anyone who wants to hear some really backbiting British 1920s, 1930s rudeness going on, if you want to read that, there are some great killer comments in here, which it sounds like I'm like, Beatty might have been better served had he considered some of the other options for signal officers.
Yes.
The other thing I'll just say also with Prince Blip's recommendation is that book is excellent. I completely agree, it's excellent. It's also part of a series that D.K. Brown wrote.
Yes.
So if you want to know the full arc of the Royal Navy of the modern era, there's I think it's 4. Yeah, Warrior to Dreadnought. Yeah, before the Ironclad.
Yep.
Warrior to Dreadnought, the Grand Fleet, and Nelson to Vanguard.
All 4 are excellent, and they cover basically like anything and everything naval engineering from time immemorial from Royal Navy to end of World War II and a little bit beyond.
Well, and now our time is slowly coming to an end, so we shall touch the big question: the who won and and why. So let's try to now go to a short, distilled version of who won and why by our panelists in no particular order. Let's start with Prince Blip.
Okay, so I want to set the stage a little bit here. So we're in the middle of 1916. So we're May 31st, 1916, right in the middle of the Great World War. Things have been getting onto steam. People have been fighting for a couple of years now, and Britain's coming out of several PR disasters. It would probably be a way to put it nicely. You had Gallipoli at the end of 1915, finally ending. You have several events in the early part of 1916 that weren't so great, and then right before Jutland's happening, you have the Battle of Verdun beginning in France, and also Italy isn't doing so well in their 4th or 5th Battle of the Isonzo River, and it's all these things are like the Allies are not in a good party. Oh yeah, Russia's also getting the bejesus kicked out of them at the moment. It's not looking good for the Allies, and they really need this knight in shining armor to come out, the Royal Navy to come out and win something big to kind of get things rolling again and turn the tide of battle around. That's not what the press gets out of Battle of Jutland. I do believe that the Battle of Jutland was won by the British, even to an extent tactically as well as strategically. While on paper the Germans win tactically, Britain basically shuts down the German Navy from effectively operating in the Atlantic, as well as proves that they are the supreme naval power for the time being, and so basically they eliminate the Germany's ability to operate, and they go on from there. The press makes a big hullabaloo about the early German reporting of losses or earlier German of sinkings, but things turn around, and the press machine is able to figure out kind of what happened, and it's a PR loss, but overall I think the Royal Navy comes out on top. Sorry if I explained that a little poorly.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So now, Dr. Clark.
Okay, so this is coming from someone who's recently been called a tea-boo.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I drink iron brew, not tea.
Mm.
So leaving that to one side, yeah, the thing is, for the Germans, it's not good enough for them to have we sunk more of your ships, because the Royal Navy had a lot more ships to begin with, and let's be honest, the Renowns are in service as of August and September 1916. So, you know, at that point, you have to consider the British do not go long without being able to go, right then, yeah, we're back at full strength. We're up, we're running. They will, of course, famously take part in the Second Battle of Heligan Blight, etc. But Jutland is about for the Germans. If they sink a big enough portion of the Royal Navy that they have equal numbers, then it'd be a win. Anything less than that is a problem. Anything which involves them getting heavily damaged, so it takes months to repair their ships, and is going to impede their operations, and they're not going to get them replaced, is a loss. So I would say they win the battle cruiser portion of the battle, in that the run to the south and the run to the north. I would say they are winning those points. I would say the trouble is the moment they bump into the actual Grand Fleet itself. That's the battle they lose. Yes, they still get a further kill. Yes, they do achieve these things on the older ships, but again, the British have more ships to lose, and that's terrible to say, because you don't want to lose anyone. No one goes into a battle thinking, I want to lose people, I want to lose ships. You don't. But the Royal Navy goes into this battle with 28 battleships and 9 battle cruisers. So that's 37 dreadnoughts. The Germans go into the battle with 16 battleships, 5 battle cruisers, and 6 pre-dreadnoughts. So their total force is 27. They've got 10 less capital ships than the British. Before they even begin, they don't sink 10 ships, they sink 3. They're still outnumbered. And that's including pre-dreadnoughts in their numbers. So this is the point for the Germans. They are on a hiding to nothing. They can never really win that fight. Unless submarines or unless something else gets involved, they cannot win that fight. And the other problem for them is that the Royal Navy loses 3 ships. The Royal Navy is very upset. There'll be 2 more launched quite quickly. There are R-class battleships coming online. They have other dreadnoughts they can call in from around the world. Those losses, they're not losses the Royal Navy wants to take, but if any navy can afford to lose dreadnoughts, it's probably the Royal Navy. And it's the older ones they lose. And in a way, and this is going to sound terrible, because they were losses, the Royal Navy then gets to concentrate efforts and resources on bringing new ships onto the line, whereas the Germans have to use the resources to do something which is far more expensive: rebuild ships. Because the Germans don't have the ability to bring the new ships onto the line. And that's the big trouble for the German Navy. They can't. So I would say they win the first part of the battle. They win a battle versus BT. I'm not surprised. They've come close to it on several occasions before this time, and BT's usually been able to pull himself out through a combination of luck, Blucher, and luck. His luck ran out at Jutland.
Okay.
That's the problem.
Yeah. And the recap from the last of our guests.
Hey, I haven't said anything yet.
Oh, sorry. Damn it.
It's Wesley's turn first.
Yeah. Sorry. Long day. Sorry.
So what I would say to this question is, when trying to look at like a winner-loser situation in kind of an inconclusive battle, no matter kind of how you think about it, I try to look at what the objectives of the fleets were. right? Maybe there is the stated objectives of the fleet, and then there's the actual objectives of the fleet and kind of the wider picture that they're taking part in. So if you look at the German fleet, their goal with Jutland was to isolate a small piece of the Royal Navy, hopefully be these battle cruisers, but they probably would have taken anything, and destroy it. And as Dr. Clark said, in the first stages of the battle, they were doing pretty good in that. And then in the second part, they just, had to get away because the Grand Fleet appeared. The British were hoping to catch the German fleet and deliver a decisive victory. Hopefully, like that's best case scenario. And while these were the stated objectives, the larger objectives of both navies is to assist their nation in winning the war. And to do that, the German fleet needed to do something drastic. They go in this battle, they do sink some ships, but they take a lot of damage in return. If I remember correctly, like in the days and weeks after the battle, they're actually in a worse place because more of their ships took damage than they were before the battle began. And the British don't actually need to do that. They are already in the better position, both ship numbers, geographically, wider war considerations. And so their definition of win is different than for the Germans. It's totally unfair because it's all about decisions and resources poured in over the last 8 years that put them in that position. But that, a lot of times war isn't fair. I will make a World of Warships comparison. It's a video game you may have heard of. Mm-hmm. The British are essentially at, let's say, 800 points. They hold all 3 caps in a random game. They just have to sit there and they win. Maybe it's not as glorious and amazing as they want to win. It's not Trafalgar, but they still win. Yeah. And they did that at Jutland. And even the decisions that were perhaps criticized at times, like Jellicoe's turn away from the torpedoes, got them to that position where not losing is winning in this case.
Although on World of Warships today, I was in a great scenario with the Constellation being my ship, being the last one in service, and the opponents being 3 last cruisers. And I got to prove that a Lexington-class battlecruiser was very good at doing one thing, wiping out enemy cruisers. They thought they could get a jump on me because they had 3-1. And they had all the bases, but, they
got greedy.
See, they should have been more cautious. They should have turned away and ran away.
Yeah.
Oh, they should have run, but that was because, and nicest way, I was charging them as fast as I could go.
Well, that's uncomfortable for them.
It was fun for me.
Yeah. Okay, so now, Drachenifel as the last.
Yes. Yeah. So, I think it comes down to a few things for me. Kind of like Dr. Clark said, I actually very strongly divide the battle into 2 segments. The battle cruiser action and the battle fleet action. The battle cruiser action, undoubtedly, you have to hand it to the Germans. They won. The 5th battle squadron basically saves it from being a complete massacre. If you look at the numbers of ships damaged, number of ships lost, etc., casualties, every metric of that engagement is completely in the Germans' favour. When you then look at the rest of the battle, from the minute the Grand Fleet opens fire, it's basically the other way round. The Germans actually, from that time segment on, take more losses tonnage-wise, and far, far, far more ships damaged, which is something Wesley picked up on. 24 hours after the battle is over, the British have brought Queen Elizabeth out of dock. They've brought Emperor of India out of dock. They've brought Australia out of dock. So pretty much almost all the battleship, and they can bring Dreadnought up if they really want to, almost all the battleship damage, long-term damage that needs to be fixed, is already made good. Some of the battlecruiser losses are made good, not all of them, but as Dr. Clark said, they bring Renown and Repulse in later on in the year. The Germans have lost Lutzow. They replace that with Hindenburg later on, but that takes a bit longer. But the critical thing is that a lot of the damage that the other British ships have taken doesn't require that much time in dock to fix. Some of the ships are a little bit beaten up, but they're the ones that are largely being replaced by those ships that are being brought out of dock. And overall, 24 hours after the battle, Jellicoe signals that the fleet is basically ready to go out and do this again, with almost the same strength that they've had 24, 48 hours earlier. Scheer, on the other hand, most of his most modern battleships are really badly beaten up and will need 6 months or so, or sometimes more, to get repaired. Seydlitz has actually sunk. It just happened to sink in port, so it was lucky. Obviously, it's down Lutzow as well. The rest of the German battle cruisers are mauled. They need a lot of time to repair. First scouting group basically doesn't exist 24 hours after Jutland. So even though the British are down a few battle cruisers, that doesn't actually matter because there's nothing to fight against them. And as I said, likewise, Scheer's heaviest best ships are pretty much out of action. The High Seas Fleet is not in a position to sail again in its Jutland scale strength for the rest of 1916. So that gives you an idea of how much damage each side has actually inflicted on the other. So in that sense, I would say tactically, it's kind of a draw because the Germans they win one half, the British win the other half. Strategically, as Wesley said, the British still have the boot on the throat of the German ocean transportation. Germany is slowly starving. The High Seas Fleet has failed to do anything to break that situation and will continue to fail to do anything to break that situation. And the number of extra ships that come online thereafter is massively in the British favour. As I said, you've got the Revenge class coming in. You've got, for what value the Courageous class are. The Germans get Hindenburg, and they get whichever one of Baden and Bayern wasn't complete because the other one was on trials, and that's it. So overall, the strategic victory has to go to the British, and I think one of the best ways to wrap that segment up for me is actually what was written in a newspaper. I think it was an American newspaper. I can't be sure, but it's always stuck with me since I read it, which was it was written in the form of a little poem, and it says, "The Germans cry we've won, but it is a curious view when it's the conquerors that run and the vanquished that pursue." And that's basically it. At the end of the day, Scheer got back to port, having run from Jellicoe, and apart from saying we need bigger guns, in not so many words to the Kaiser, said, "I never want to do that again." Jellicoe was sitting there going, "When's round 2?"
And I would add that, to be honest, the Germans do try to repeat it in an action which takes place on the 19th of August 1916. It doesn't follow the same lessons of Jutland, but the Germans do sortie with. They managed to put together a fleet of 18 battle cruisers, 18 battleships and 2 battle cruisers. And the Royal Navy has a force of 29 battleships and 6 battle cruisers, so it's 35 versus 20 this time. And it's an indecisive action, is what it's officially called, but in reality, nothing much happens to fleets. The Germans turn back before the British actually managed to really get to grips with them. The moment the Germans realise that the British are really, really there in strength, they decide that they don't want to be anywhere near there. But after that, there are battles in the North Sea. There are battles which take place. The German fleet doesn't. There's often this sort of things in World War I and World War II. In World War II, it's after Taranto, the Italian fleet never comes to sea again. Well, Matapan happens, so that obviously is not the case, and there's lots of battles. The same with Germany after the Battle of Jutland. They do come to sea again, they do try again, but they are incredibly gun shy. For someone who claims that, who is basically saying they won the battle and they were glorious and victorious, they are incredibly gun shy. And let's be honest, as I said, by August 1916, when that second action almost takes place, it's as near as enough the British are outnumbering the Germans 2-1. It's 35-20. You know, it's a huge preponderance. And Twit's even more advanced.
Yeah, I would actually just thinking aloud, it would seem to me that while the strategic victory is quite clear, it is also kind of a situation where neither side really like neither side was really happy with the outcome in that they didn't win as much as they wanted to, because I mean the Germany wanted to trap the battle cruisers and preferably utterly destroy them. The Grand Fleet wanted to preferably end the threat of the Hochseeflotte right there and then, and neither side was really like neither side achieved their goals, and like yeah.
Well, no battle plan survives contact with the enemy.
Yes, exactly. But I'm afraid we have run out of time now. Definitely, it's really getting late here. So I will ask for a quick final words. And obviously plugs for your channels, books, whatever might come there. So let's start with Wesley.
Sure. So I'm Wesley Livesey again. You can find me History of the Great War podcast, History of the Second World War podcast. I think there's a link below my name at some point during this stream.
Yes.
I would just say on my final words on the Battle of Jutland is it sure has generated a lot of discussion over the years. So I guess historians won in the end.
Historians
Thank you.
always win.
Dr. Clark.
On the Battle of Jutland, I think it's one of the great what-ifs of history. There are a few which are there in the world, and Jutland is seriously one of the what-ifs of history because both sides had such dreams and neither managed to achieve it. As for things I've got, well, I have a YouTube channel where I've just done a whole load of series on dreadnoughts and the development of the dreadnought battleship and the battle cruiser and all sorts of things and videos on my Dr. Alexander Clark Naval History channel. I'm very, very close to having 6,000 subscribers, so if I do get there, I'll be really, really happy. I'm like 36 away and have been hovering there for about the last week and a half. So, you know, if 36 people feel like subscribing, I'd be very happy to finally reach 6,000. And I have a book coming out later this year, which you probably heard mentioned at the beginning, which is called Tribals, Battles, and Daring Class Destroyers. And it's the genesis of the General Purpose Destroyer and the Royal Navy's large fleet destroyer program pre, during, and after World War II, and where they come from and how they're building up to fill a gap they have in their cruiser forces. And yeah, so also I have a Twitter account, and I'm also working on a edited Falklands book with my wonderful girlfriend, who we are jointly editing it together, where other people are writing the chapters, because she's done her PhD at Manchester, which is Manchester University in the Falklands War, and I do a lot of work on the Falklands War, so we're doing that, and hoping to organise a conference next year on board HMS Belfast, if get permission from Belfast, which we're still having fun with. But, you know, all sorts of fun things.
And last but not least, Drachenifel.
Have we given Wesley his shot?
Yes.
Yes, I
We
can do
did?
it again if we need to.
Oh, did we? Okay.
If you missed it, I can do it just for you.
Sorry, I must be confused. Anyway. Right, okay, so I'm obviously youtube.com/Drachenifel. That's where you'll find most of my stuff, live streams, videos of varying lengths and descriptions. I do have a Twitter, which I do occasionally use. Usually sometimes to post spoilers of various photos and such like that I've scanned in and will eventually make publicly available when I have the time to upload them to my website. That's basically most of what I do online. As far as closing thoughts on the Battle of Jutland go, I would point out that apart from everything else we've discussed, strategic implications, tactical implications, what ships were lost, what ships were not lost, command decisions, etc. At the end of the day, almost 10,000 people did not come home. More on the British side than the German, but the Germans were still down several thousand people. That is a lot of human suffering that resulted from this battle. And that's just the people that didn't come home at all. There were plenty more people who didn't either come home physically with all the attached limbs and such, flash burns and all sorts of horrific injuries, and a lot of people who didn't come home fully mentally either. So there was an awful human cost to this, and we always have to remember that no matter how spectacular the battle might be, it's the sailors, the officers and men who ultimately pay the price for all of this. So it's not all just fun and games, even though we can discuss it perhaps almost over 100 years removed without necessarily feeling that impact as hard as people did at the time. It was very definitely there.
Thank you. And thank all of you for joining us here today, for having a very, very interesting and, pretty long discussion, but I don't think there were any, and there was any slack period. We were just talking about Jutland. And I have a suspicion that we could be talking like 2.5 more hours because it's just such a huge and absolutely immense topic. And basically all of you touch it more in details from various angles in your channels. So again, recommendation to everyone who's watching. I've dropped the links into the chats both on YouTube and on Twitch. If you want to know more, go ahead to all these free channels and go ham, listen to everything, watch everything, because the videos and the podcasts are very, very, very interesting. And yeah, the time is up. So again, thank you for coming over. And let's meet you in future installments. I can already say that the next topic for June will actually not be a battle, but we will try something else. We will try to talk about the crazy, let's say, super battleship projects. Not only super battleships, basically all the crazy huge projects like your H-43-44, your Tillman class battleships, your Super Yamato designs, maybe even Project Habakkuk, even though it's a non-traditional aircraft carrier. But we will be talking all these sorts of things, so that should be fun. And yeah, I'll now just switch to me and Prince Blip for a quick farewell, and then we will vacate this channel for today. So once again, thank you, and well, see you around.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
And now it's just the two of us. So what are your final words?
So thank you for coming, everybody. I was glad to be here for my first installment of Armchair Admirals. If you are from the World of Warships Legends Cloud or are interested in more detailed history about specifically ships, I will be hosting a live stream on the World of Warships Legends channel, both on Twitch and YouTube, on June 11th, about when we'll be going over the long and convoluted history of Royal Navy cruisers, both the light and heavy cruisers, because you can't really ignore one or the other. And so I would be pleased if you would join me there. And thank you, on. And I will go and pass it on to Chucky to close it.
Thank you very much. And yeah, as I said, next time we will be talking super crazy super battleships. And in the meantime, you will probably see me around on some regular streams. Tomorrow, I'm doing Jutland Part 2, this time on a Czech stream. So I'll be kind of overcompensating for our lack of sea. But yeah, that's probably not of interest to most watchers here. But in the meantime, enjoy the coming summer, have fun, and see you in a month with super crazy super battleships. Goodbye, and thanks for watching.